On the night of August 22, 2004, in an extremely affluent neighborhood in Florida, millionaire lawyer John Sutton dragged himself across the floor of his bedroom. He couldn't see anything, and his head was in agonizing pain, but somehow, some way, he still managed to pull himself up to his feet, and then he staggered his way through the house and made it out the front door to safety. However, there was still someone else in the house behind him. Moments later, a Miami SWAT team entered John's house, and they would make a horrifying discovery in the guest bedroom, one that would stun the wealthy South Florida community where John and his family had lived and worked for over 4 decades. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're over at the Amazon Music Follow Button's house, be sure to steal all of their phone chargers and hide them in the toilet tank. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a hot July morning in 2004, 56-year-old Susan Sutton and her husband John stepped out of their million-dollar home in Coral Gables, Florida. It was one of those days in South Florida when the temperature was a hot 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but the humidity made it feel even hotter. Susan could already feel sweat on her arms, and her shirt was sticking to her skin as she and John walked to their car parked in the driveway. But the heat didn't bother Susan. She loved the summer weather. Susan climbed into the passenger seat of the car, and her husband John got behind the wheel. They pulled away from the house and then headed through Coral Gables towards a nearby town where they were going to have breakfast with their son and his fiancée. Susan was average height, and she had a bright smile with perfect teeth. She had dirty blonde hair, but she sometimes missed dyeing it bright blonde like she'd done when she was younger. As for her husband John, he was tall with graying hair and blue eyes. When Susan and John were a young couple, people couldn't get over how good they looked together, like a fairy tale couple. And even as they got older, most people who knew them thought Susan and John were a perfect pair who had everything you could ever ask for. As the couple drove along, Susan glanced out the window and watched the city pass by. Susan had lived in Coral Gables since she was 13 years old, and as far as she was concerned, there was no better place to live in the whole world. Coral Gables was known as one of the most upscale communities in the Miami, Florida area. The secluded enclave was dotted with Mediterranean-style houses sitting on huge lots with palm trees in the front yards and big swimming pools in the back. The city was safe, beautiful, and only about 10 miles from Miami Beach. In the car, Susan and John talked about their work for a while. John was a very successful attorney, and Susan managed his and his partner's law firm. Some of their friends would ask Susan and John if it was difficult to work with their spouse. They figured always being together must get old at some point. But Susan said she loved working with John and managing his office, and she said John's partner, a gifted lawyer named Teddy Montoto, and all the employees at the office were like extended family. So she barely even saw the law firm as work. After driving for about 45 minutes, John turned onto a residential street and he parked the car in front of a new townhouse. John and Susan got out of the car, and they walked up to the townhouse front door. They had bought this townhouse for their son and his fiancée about a month earlier, and they couldn't wait to see what the young couple had done to the inside of their new place. Susan knocked on the door, and then her 25-year-old son, Christopher, opened it up with a huge grin on his face. Christopher was a big guy. He was over 6 feet tall, and he weighed about 250 pounds. So when he hugged his mom, she almost disappeared in his arms. Christopher led his parents inside, and right away Susan could smell food cooking in the kitchen. Christopher beamed while he led his parents through the townhouse and showed them all the new furniture and decorations that he and his fiancée, Juliette Driscoll, had added to the place since they'd moved in. While Christopher gave his parents a tour of the place, Juliet shouted out, "Hello," from the kitchen, and then she came out and joined everybody in the living room a couple of minutes later. Juliet was 23 years old, and she was pretty with long brown hair. Susan and John both said that she kind of reminded them of the hippies, the free-spirited folks they'd grown up with in the 1960s. Juliet hugged Susan and John and told them how excited she was that they'd come over for breakfast. Susan and John had treated Juliet almost like their own daughter ever since the time she and Christopher had begun dating. And now Susan and John were thrilled that the two of them were planning their wedding. And Susan and John were also very happy that they'd been able to provide Christopher and Juliet with such a wonderful place to live as they began this new phase of their life together. Christopher led his parents into their small dining room, and then John and Susan took a seat at the table. Then Christopher went into the kitchen and he helped Juliet bring out all the food. After the food was served, they began to eat, and as they did, the whole group began to talk, mostly about work. Juliet was the receptionist at John's law firm, and she knew he was in the middle of a huge case, and so she asked him how it was going. Then the subject changed to Christopher and Juliet's wedding planning. Susan immediately got so excited hearing about the design for the invitations and the honeymoon they were going to take in Samoa, a collection of islands in the South Pacific. Susan was excited, like most other moms would be when their oldest child was finally getting married, but there was actually more to it than that for her. Because there was a time in Susan's life when she had believed she would never have kids. 30 years earlier, back in 1974, Susan and John had been set up on a blind date. And within a few minutes of meeting each other, they both decided that going on that blind date was the best decision they'd ever made. After that first meeting, Susan and John had quickly fallen in love and started planning the rest of their lives together. And both of them knew that they wanted to start a family as soon as possible. Susan loved kids, and she had dreamed of being a mother since she was young. But soon after Susan and John did get married, about a year after that first blind date, Susan had the first of several miscarriages. And in the years following, she had undergone a series of unsuccessful fertility treatments, and eventually she was just told by her doctors that unfortunately she would never be able to bear her own kids. At the time when this news came in, Susan had felt like she'd somehow let her husband down and robbed him of the family and the future that they had both dreamed about. But then, Susan had looked into adoption. She knew there were children all over the world who needed homes, and she and John had a very safe and loving home that they could provide. So, 4 years after the couple had gotten married, Susan and John's dream of starting a family came true when they adopted and brought home Christopher when he was just 2 days old. Then, 7 years later, they had adopted their daughter, Melissa, and their family finally felt perfect and complete. At the dining room table, Susan smiled as she listened to her son talk about his and Juliet's wedding, and while she didn't say it out loud, she was already looking forward to the day that she would become a grandmother. The family finished their breakfast and continued talking for a while, but then John said he needed to get home and call his partner, Teddy Montoto, so they could do some work on their current case. Susan thanked Juliet for the amazing food, and then followed John outside the townhouse back to the car. Later that day, while John worked, Susan thought about going swimming in the pool. But first, she wanted to check on her daughter, Melissa, who had just moved away for her first year of college. So Susan called Melissa, and right away she could tell her daughter was very nervous about her classes that were going to start in a few weeks. Susan and John had always taken their kids' education very seriously, and they had been able to send them to great schools. Christopher had even attended an international boarding school when he was a teenager. So Susan told Melissa she was absolutely prepared for college and that she was going to do great. Then Susan told her daughter that she loved her, hung up, and went into the living room where John was working. She asked him how it was going. John grinned and said it was actually going really well, and he was pretty sure he and his partner, Teddy, were about to make a lot of money. Susan kissed John and said that if that happened, they should definitely have Teddy and everybody else from the law firm over to celebrate. Then she headed upstairs, put on her bathing suit, and went out to the pool. Susan lounged by the pool in the hot summer sun and looked out over the large canal that circled their neighborhood. Being on the canal made the house feel even more like an oasis that was separate from the rest of the world. And as Susan lay there lounging in the sun, she thought about her son getting married and her daughter starting college, and her husband potentially about to win a huge lucrative legal case, and she wondered if it was even possible for her to be any happier. In the early evening of August 22, 2004, about a month after the breakfast at Christopher's, music and laughter drifted through Susan and John's house. They were hosting a big party to celebrate both Susan's 57th birthday and also John's huge win in court that had made them over $1 million. John walked around the house, pouring champagne for friends, family, and employees from the law firm. At one point, most of the partygoers were gathered in the living room, and John raised his glass. He said he knew people were there to celebrate Susan and himself, but he said he wanted to give a toast to his son Christopher and to his fiancée Juliette, who would soon be his daughter-in-law. And so everyone else raised up their glasses and cheered on the young couple. Then John stepped away from the group and then returned shortly after, but this time with his phone in his hand. He held the phone up, and his daughter Melissa said hello to everybody. Then she wished her mom a happy birthday and said how bummed she was that she couldn't be there. Susan told Melissa that she missed her too, but she said that she was so excited that Melissa was actually starting her college classes now and was really getting into the flow of life in college. Susan hung the phone up, and as she did, she heard a fork clinking against a glass. She looked across the living room towards the sound, and she saw that John's partner, Teddy, was now getting ready to make another toast. Once everyone was listening, Teddy stopped clinking the glass, and then he told everyone in the room how lucky he had been to meet John and get to work with him, and how Susan and the kids had made him feel like he was a part of their family. Melissa even referred to Teddy as her godfather. Then Teddy toasted to the birthday girl, Susan, shouted cheers, and downed his drink, and everybody else did the same. The party lasted for a few hours, and then everybody started to clear out. Christopher and Juliette wished Susan happy birthday again, and then they left, and then Teddy and the rest of the law firm employees left not long after them. At about 10 p.m., John headed to the main bedroom to lie down and watch some of the Summer Olympics on TV. Susan got dressed for bed, she kissed John goodnight, and then she walked down the hall to the guest bedroom. Lately, Susan had been sleeping in that guest bedroom because John often stayed up late either working or watching TV to wind down from work. In the guest room, Susan climbed under the covers, and then she put her phone on the nightstand. She was expecting a call. And a few minutes later, her phone rang, so she smiled and answered it. But almost as soon as she had put the phone to her ear, she stopped talking, because she thought she heard something moving around outside of her door. Susan tossed the phone down on the bed next to her and strained her ears to listen, and as she did, a terrified look came across her face. She could hear John screaming from the bedroom down the hall, but before she could get up to see what was going on, her door flung open. And when Susan looked up, she screamed and pulled the covers tight. At 10:30 p.m., so just minutes after the door to Susan's bedroom had swung open, John crawled across the floor in the main bedroom. He could feel warm blood running down his face from both of his eyes, and he couldn't see anything. Pain ripped through his face, his arms, his hands, but somehow John managed to grab the bedside table, and he pulled himself up to his knees. He ran his hands along the table and felt his phone. He grabbed it, flipped it open, ran his fingers over the numbers on the keypad, and dialed 911. When the emergency operator picked up, John yelled out that he'd been shot, and then he shouted his address and said he did not know if his wife was okay. Then, with the phone still in his hand, John crawled across the floor to the bedroom door. He grabbed the doorknob and got to his feet. The pain at this point was agonizing, but John stumbled out into the hall and he staggered towards the front of the house, feeling his way along the wall the whole time. The 911 operator said police and paramedics were on the way, but John could barely understand what they were saying. His ears were ringing, his breath was labored, and he felt himself starting to lose consciousness. Minutes later, John made his way to the front door, still unable to see anything, but he reached out and grabbed the doorknob and used whatever strength he had left to throw the door open. Outside, he could hear sirens wailing in the distance as cars and trucks sped towards his house. A minute later, an ambulance pulled up out front, and a Miami-Dade County paramedic leapt out and ran towards the house. The young man couldn't believe what he was seeing. John had multiple open wounds and was losing massive amounts of blood. The paramedic had no idea how John had been able to get to his feet and make it outside considering his wounds, but either way, the paramedic rushed over to John and told him he was here to help, at which point John felt for the EMT and just collapsed into his arms. A few minutes later, a SWAT truck roared down the street in the affluent Coral Gables neighborhood. John and Susan's neighbors had already stepped outside of their houses when the ambulance arrived, and they had watched as John was loaded into the ambulance on a stretcher before it sped down the street. Now, most of the neighbors stood there in total shock. SWAT vehicles were not something they were used to seeing. The SWAT truck came to a stop outside of John and Susan's house, and several members of the Miami Police Department SWAT team stepped out. They crouched down low with their weapons in hand and all their tactical gear on, and they slowly approached the front door. When the 911 call had come in, it wasn't clear if there was still a perpetrator on the premises, so police were just not taking any chances, hence the SWAT team. One of the SWAT officers approached the front door and fired a concussion grenade into the house. A concussion grenade creates a really loud bang and bright light, and it can release low-density fragments to temporarily incapacitate anyone who is within the explosion area. After the concussion grenade had exploded, several SWAT officers immediately entered the house and began doing a sweep of all the rooms. 2 officers walked down the hallway towards the guest bedroom. The door was open, and they entered with their weapons drawn. But when they stepped inside that room, all they saw were sheets and a comforter piled up on the bed. One of the officers stepped closer and saw multiple bullet holes in that comforter, and he also saw bloodstains on the wall behind the headboard. The officer leaned over and pulled back the comforter and sheets, and when he did, he kind of hung his head down in respect. Under all those covers and sheets was Susan Sutton, and she was dead. She had been shot multiple times at close range. It was a horrific scene, but it was not just the violence that got to these SWAT officers that found her. Based on the position of Susan's hands and how the sheets and comforter had appeared on the bed, the officers could tell that in her sheer panic and fear, Susan had attempted to hide under the covers like a child to protect herself from her killer. And the thought of that just seemed absolutely tragic. The SWAT officers completed their sweep of the house, and at the end of it, they were certain the killer was no longer on the premises. So the SWAT team headed outside to wait for detectives from the Miami-Dade County Police to show up. But as the SWAT officers crossed the front yard, they heard a car come to a screeching halt not far from the house. And then they saw that car's door fly open, and a man jumped out and began running towards them with a gun in his hand. The SWAT officers jumped into action and shouted at the man to put his weapon down, and this man quickly obeyed, holstering his weapon and raising his hands up into the air. And as soon as he did, one of the SWAT officers rushed over to confront him, to figure out why he was here and why he was brandishing a weapon. The man said he was just there to help because he knew there had to have been a shooter in the house. The man introduced himself as Teddy Montoto, John's partner at the law firm. The officer said he didn't care who he was. He just wanted an explanation of how Teddy could possibly know there had been a shooter inside of the house, because the police had not made any announcements of any kind about what was going on at this property. Teddy looked at the SWAT officer and said he knew there was a shooter inside the house because he'd literally heard gunshots when he was on the phone with Susan Sutton. Later that night, detectives Larry Bellew and Art Nanny of the Miami-Dade County Police stood in the Sutton guest room, staring down at Susan's body. Both detectives were big guys with broad shoulders and barrel chests, and they both looked like they could handle themselves in a fight if they ever had to. Like the SWAT officers who had discovered Susan, it hit these detectives hard that Susan had desperately tried to save herself by hiding under the covers before she was killed. They couldn't imagine how scared she must have been in that final moment, and it made them both just so angry at whoever had done this. When the detectives had first arrived at the scene, they wondered if maybe John had murdered his wife and then failed to kill himself in an attempted murder-suicide. But the detectives had contacted paramedics and doctors at the hospital that John had been taken to, and medical personnel made it clear that John had multiple defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, so they were certain somebody else had shot him. Doctors also told detectives Bellew and Nanny that John had been placed in a medically induced coma because he had been shot in the head. A medically induced coma could help protect John from suffering brain damage if he even lived. So Bellew and Nanny knew that they could not talk to John to try to learn what had happened inside the house that night. Forensics officers and ballistics experts in the room told the two detectives that they had found enough evidence to determine that Susan had been killed by being shot at close range with a handgun. So as the forensics team continued to work, Bellew and Nanny thought they might already have their primary suspect, John's partner, Teddy, who had arrived out of nowhere waving a handgun around. So the detectives walked out to the street in front of the house where they had instructed Teddy to stay with several local police officers. Detective Bellew was all business when he approached Teddy. He'd already learned that Teddy was a very successful lawyer, so he was pretty sure Teddy would know how all of this worked. Bellew said they wanted to bring Teddy to the station for questioning, and they wanted to test his hands for gunpowder residue before they left. Teddy said he understood, and he told the detectives that they would most likely find gunpowder residue on his hands because he'd actually been at the shooting range earlier that day. Bellew and Nanny thought that it was possible that that could be true, but they also figured that being a successful attorney, Teddy would also know a trick or two to try to cover up his tracks. But the detectives believed that even the smartest criminals always miss something. So they were sure if Teddy really had killed Susan and then attempted to kill John, they would find out soon enough. In the early morning of August 23rd, a few hours after Susan's murder, her son Christopher was sitting outside the hospital room where his father was in a medically induced coma. And as Christopher sat there, he was listening to his little sister Melissa cry on the phone. Christopher and his fiancée had left the party at Susan and John's the night before and gone to a late movie. And when he got out of that movie, Christopher saw that he had a bunch of missed calls from Teddy, friends, and family. And not long after that, he had learned what happened to his parents. Christopher had at least been with his fiancée when he got the news about his parents, but he felt absolutely terrible that his younger sister was alone in her college dorm room in a place where she really still didn't know that many people. Christopher had always been very protective of Melissa when they were growing up, and even when he'd left the country to go to a boarding school overseas, he'd missed his sister more than anybody else. Outside the hospital room, Christopher listened to Melissa continue to cry on the phone, and as she did, he wished he could do more to comfort her. But Christopher told Melissa that he was still trying to figure out what had even happened and what was going on now. And he said he was really worried that whoever had killed their mom might actually show up at the hospital to try to finish the job on their dad. This sent Melissa into a complete panic, and she began saying she needed to come home right away, but she didn't have her car at school. Melissa said she knew Christopher needed to stay with their dad, so she would call Teddy, the man she referred to as her godfather, to come pick her up. Christopher thought this was a good idea, and he promised Melissa he would make sure nothing happened to their dad while he was there. They said they loved each other and then hung up. Then Christopher went back inside the hospital room to be by his father's side, while Melissa quietly packed a bag in her dorm room and tried to get a hold of Teddy. Melissa's initial calls to Teddy went unanswered because, at that time, he was sitting inside of an interrogation room across from Detectives Bellew and Nanny. The room they were in was barely bigger than a closet. It seemed designed to make people uncomfortable, but Teddy was actually unaffected by it. This was a guy who made a lot of money questioning and cross-examining people in court. He knew the law inside and out, and he almost always felt like he was 2 or 3 steps ahead of anybody he was talking to. But Teddy also respected law enforcement. He had relied on them throughout his legal career, so he did his best to be polite and attentive as the detectives questioned him. Bellew started by asking Teddy again why he had shown up at the Sutton house carrying a gun. Teddy said he had been talking to Susan on the phone about work when he heard, on her end of the phone, gunshots. He said Susan and John were like his family, so all he could think to do was just rush to help them if he could. The detectives nodded as Teddy talked, but they still were not sold on his version of events. They thought it was possible that Teddy could have attacked Susan and John and then rushed out of their house and then magically returned to the scene soon after, trying to play the hero so police wouldn't suspect him. At some point, Bellew asked Teddy about his business relationship with John. He wanted to know if there were any financial issues between the two men. Also, Detective Bellew knew they were dealing with victims here who were multimillionaires, so a dispute about money had to at least be considered as a potential motive. But Teddy didn't miss a beat. He said he owed his entire career to John, and they both helped each other make a ton of money, so there were no financial issues at all between them. Detective Bellew just sat there and stared at Teddy. He had nothing against Teddy, and he wasn't ready to just declare Teddy guilty or anything, but it was clear that Teddy thought he was in total control of this interrogation, so Bellew wanted to take advantage of what seemed like Teddy's arrogance. Bellew asked Teddy if he would take a polygraph test, which would make it easier for police to cross him off their list, and Teddy agreed. So Bellew and Nanny stepped out of the room, and they began talking about how the interrogation was going as they went to go arrange for this polygraph test. Both detectives thought Teddy was the kind of guy who would believe he could beat a polygraph even if he was lying. But they were pretty sure if Teddy was lying, the test would catch him. Later that morning, Teddy would sit for his polygraph test. And afterwards, as Detectives Bellew and Nanny went over the test results with the examiner, they were taken aback. It appeared that Teddy had told the truth on almost all of the questions he had been asked, but there were a series of questions that Teddy had almost definitely lied about when he had given his answer, and all of those questions had to do with Susan. Bellew didn't waste any time. He approached Teddy in the interrogation room, he leaned in close and said they knew Teddy had just lied on that polygraph test, and for the first time, Teddy's entire attitude changed. The confidence and bravado disappeared, and he slumped forward in his chair. Then he looked up at Bellew with a pained expression on his face, and in a quiet voice, he said he had betrayed his best friend. He said that he and Susan had actually recently begun sleeping together. Bellew immediately turned to Nanny. They didn't have to say anything to each other, because they both knew a love triangle could be an even stronger motive for murder than money. There was a chance that Teddy, John, and Susan had gotten into a fight that got completely out of control, and that's how people got shot. Or maybe Teddy had flown into a jealous rage and just decided to kill both of them. At this point, Teddy knew the detectives were highly suspicious of him, and so he said point blank that he had nothing to do with the attack on Susan and John. He might have been a bad friend, but he loved them and their kids dearly. And later that day, police would release Teddy because they didn't have enough evidence to hold him at the time. However, they made it very clear to him that he should not leave town. Teddy said he understood, and he said despite what they think, he still wanted to help the investigation. Once Teddy was gone, Bellew and Nanny shifted their focus to the murder weapon. Susan had been killed with a handgun, and if it matched Teddy's gun, they would know they had their killer. They just had to find that gun. But over the next couple of days, as forensics officers updated the detectives, they discovered that Susan had been killed with a Glock 9mm pistol, and at that point, they could not connect that weapon to Teddy. Still, Detectives Bellew and Nanny felt if they kept digging, there was a good chance they'd be able to place Teddy at the scene of the crime with that weapon in question. So they were still confident they had a strong suspect in the case. In early September of 2004, so a couple of weeks after the murder, John suddenly sat up in his hospital bed trembling. He had recently come out of his medically induced coma, and doctors had told him that one of his eyes had been removed, and in his other eye, the optic nerve had been severed, which meant he was blind. Now, John had accepted that he would be blind for the rest of his life, and so he couldn't understand right now why he was seeing someone dressed in all black lurking in the corner of his hospital room. The person in black began to move forward, at which point John began to thrash around in his bed and he screamed as loud as he could, but the person in black was unaffected. They just kept moving closer and closer to John's bed. And then when they were right next to John, the person in black raised a gun and aimed it right at John. John screamed over and over again, and he tried to force himself out of his bed, but he just couldn't do it. And then John felt someone grab him, and he screamed and shook even more. But then John heard several people yelling his name and trying to get him to calm down, and he realized the person holding him was one of his nurses, and that she and several other members of the hospital staff were telling him that he was okay, and that nobody had been in the room with him. He was all alone. After several minutes, John did calm down, but he was convinced that Susan's killer had been in the room with him and that they had come back to finish the job and kill him. So John demanded to speak to the police. Later that day, Detectives Bellew and Nanny headed to the hospital to meet with John. Neither of them believed the killer had actually been in John's room. They had spoken to John's doctors, so they knew the medically induced coma, the medication John was still on, and the recent loss of his sight could all lead to hallucinations. But the detectives also thought John might be starting to remember who had attacked him. So when they met with him in the hospital, they didn't write off what he was saying about the attacker coming into his room. Instead, they asked him questions about what this person in black looked like. Is there any sort of description you can give? Because they were thinking that maybe what he was really remembering was actually the real attacker. And the detectives were thinking the real attacker was very likely his law partner, Teddy, and so trying to get some sort of description from John that sounded like Teddy seemed like movement in the right direction for the investigation. However, John would say he really didn't have a good description of this person in black, and he just couldn't recall who the attacker was who killed his wife and tried to kill him. But John would say he knew it was not Teddy. Teddy was not their attacker. John would say, from what he could recall of the night of the attack, that Teddy just seemed shorter than the attacker, and also the attacker seemed to move a lot faster than Teddy could. After telling the detectives the little he thought he remembered about the person in black / the attacker, John demanded to be let out of the hospital. He said it was no longer safe for him to be there, that this attacker was going to come back and kill him. Doctors, nurses, and the detectives tried to reassure John that he was safe at the hospital and that he still needed more time in the hospital to recover. But John wouldn't hear it. And even his kids, Christopher and Melissa, who by this point had made it home, could not convince their father to stay in the hospital when they got there. So, against doctors' advice, John checked himself out of the hospital and went to stay with Christopher and his fiancée in their new townhouse. And almost immediately after moving in, John would tell his daughter, Melissa, to just go back to school, and John would begin to talk about how he needed to get back to work. John said his wife would not want the family to put their lives on hold just because she was gone. Leaving the hospital that day, Detectives Bellew and Nanny had been a little shocked by what they had seen. But after what John had experienced, they understood he would be in fear for his life until they found Susan's killer and put them away. And even though John said he was sure Teddy was not the person who had attacked him and his wife, the detectives still considered Teddy their main suspect. They just altered their theory about what could have happened a bit. They thought Teddy might have hired someone to do his dirty work for him, and that Teddy had been on the phone with Susan at the time of the murder just to make sure whoever he had hired had done their job. But even with the information on Teddy and Susan's affair, Teddy's failed polygraph test, and cell phone records that proved Teddy had been on the phone with Susan when she was killed, police still didn't have enough on Teddy for a murder case to hold up in court. So they spent the next several weeks looking for the Glock 9mm that had been used to murder Susan, and searching for this mysterious person in all black that John had claimed was in the hospital room with him. But Bellew and Nanny still knew there was a chance this person in black could have simply been a figment of John's imagination. But the search for this person and the search for the gun were very slow, and so as 2004 rolled into 2005, the detectives felt like they were running out of time, and that every day the killer walked free put John and his family in more danger. On March 16, 2005, almost 7 months after Susan's murder, Detectives Bellew and Nanny raced towards a small town less than an hour away from Coral Gables. They had gotten a call from local police who had just busted a petty drug dealer on a marijuana charge, and it turned out the dealer had a criminal record, including a recent charge for threatening 2 people with a Glock 9mm pistol. When Bellew and Nanny had gotten the call, they did a quick background check on the drug dealer, and they became convinced the drug dealer was connected to Susan's murder in some way. Bellew and Nanny arrived at the local police station, and an officer led them to a small interrogation room where this drug dealer was waiting for them. And after only a few minutes, and with almost no push from the cops, this drug dealer made it very clear to them who they thought killed Susan Sutton. Based on the meeting with that drug dealer, evidence found at the scene of the crime, and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of how police believe someone murdered Susan Sutton on August 22, 2004. On that August day, at around 10 p.m., the killer walked through the shadows down the street towards Susan and John's house. They wore black jeans, a black long-sleeve shirt, black boots, and had a black knit mask pulled down over their face. They also had a Glock 9mm pistol clutched in their hand. The killer glanced at the large houses that line the street and imagined all of the stuff inside of them that must be worth stealing. But the killer had a mission to accomplish, so they turned their eyes back to Susan and John's house. A few minutes later, the killer crouched down as low as they could and ran to the side of Susan and John's house. There was a sliding glass door there that they knew did not lock properly. So they grabbed the door handle, leaned into the glass with their shoulder, which was all it took, and they slid the door open. The killer stepped into the dark home. They could hear a TV coming from the bedroom at the end of a long hallway. So they ran down the hall, passing another bedroom on the way. They got to the main bedroom at the end of the hall, and they threw open the door. And when they did, they saw John, who looked up from the bed with a look of sheer horror on his face. The killer took a few steps into the room, which was only lit by the flashing of the TV screen. The killer then raised their gun and fired. John screamed, tumbled from the bed, and fell to the floor. The killer immediately turned around and rushed out of the room and back down the hall. They came to the guest room, they threw that door open, and they saw Susan on the bed. Susan screamed and pulled the covers over her head, but the killer just walked towards her, raised their gun, and fired 6 shots directly into Susan. Bullets ripped through the comforter and sheets and struck Susan in the hands and also in her head, and she would die right there in her bed, her body slumped below the pile of covers on top of her. After that, the killer casually left the room and started walking back towards the sliding glass door that they'd used to enter the house. But when they got there, they heard a noise coming from the main bedroom. The killer immediately froze and then reflexively checked their gun to make sure they still had ammo. They'd lost count of how many times they'd fired their gun, but when they checked, they saw they were still all set. They had enough rounds. So the killer took a breath, they turned around, and marched right back down the hall. They walked back into the main bedroom, and they saw John trying to pull himself across the floor. The killer hesitated. The sight of John in agony somehow seemed far worse than a dead victim covered by bloody sheets. But the killer shook that off, and they raised their gun. John looked up, shouted something at the killer, and held his hands in front of his face to try to protect himself. The killer fired, and John immediately felt a bullet rip through the tip of one of his fingers and strike him in the face. Then another bullet tore through John's arm and struck him in the left temple. John collapsed on the floor in a pool of blood, and the killer assumed he was dead. The killer at this point rushed out of the bedroom, ran down the hall, and out the sliding glass door they had come in. The street was still quiet, but the killer was worried somebody might have heard the attack in the house. So they put their head down, started running, and weaved their way around the streetlights until they got to their car that was parked a few blocks away. The killer got into the car and drove off, and after they had gotten far enough away from John and Susan's neighborhood, they took off their mask and threw it onto the passenger seat. Then they grabbed their phone out of their pocket and made a quick phone call, but when it went to voicemail, the killer did not leave a message. They knew the person they were calling would call back as soon as the movie they were watching was over. Police had been right in their belief that the person who had killed Susan and tried to kill John had been hired to carry out the murder by someone else. But it was not Teddy, John's law firm partner who was having an affair with John's wife, Susan, who had hired the killer. It was Susan and John's adopted son, Christopher. It turned out that the boarding school Christopher had been sent to as a teenager wasn't some sort of upscale school for rich kids. It was a school located in Samoa that employed corporal punishment and hard labor to try to alter the behavior of children whose parents basically believed their kids needed some form of severe discipline. And when Christopher was a teenager, his parents, Susan and John, had started to believe that he was turning into this violent young man who they couldn't get under control. Christopher had physically threatened Susan and had even written down notes about how he could murder his parents to get their money. And so after local boarding schools had failed to change Christopher's behavior, Susan and John made a drastic decision. In the middle of the night, when Christopher was 16 years old, he had been taken from the home against his will, driven to the airport, and then shipped off to Samoa. And Christopher had never forgiven his parents for that. And so after Christopher had finally gotten out of that Samoa school and returned to Florida at the age of 19, he bided his time and started planning his parents' murder. Christopher had spent some time selling drugs right when he got back from Samoa, and not long before the murder, he had reconnected with a friend who had been a fellow dealer and who didn't have the same financial opportunities that Christopher had. Christopher knew that if his parents were dead, he and his sister would inherit millions of dollars. And so he promised this drug dealer friend that he would give him $100,000 if he carried out the murders. The drug dealer agreed to do it, and over time, Christopher helped him get a complete layout of Susan and John's home, including the sliding glass door that never locked the right way. Christopher also let the dealer know that his parents often slept in separate bedrooms. Then, when Christopher got word about the party to celebrate his mother's birthday and his father's successful legal case, he knew the time was right. Plenty of people would be at the house that night, so he thought that might mislead police into going down the wrong path. Then he would make sure he and his fiancée were seen at the party before they left and went to a late movie that would give Christopher an alibi for the time of the murders. But Detectives Bellew and Nanny had always thought that even the smartest criminals usually overlooked something. And they weren't sure if Christopher and his friend were all that smart. Because when Christopher's drug-dealing friend/hitman got busted on the drug charge, police discovered that he had called Christopher multiple times every day for months, starting just minutes after Susan's murder. And when they presented this call log evidence to the drug dealer, he quickly caved and confessed to the murder and immediately implicated Christopher as the guy who told him to do it. Then Christopher's fiancée admitted to police that Christopher had been talking to her about wanting to murder his parents since right after they met. She just never thought he would go through with it. And so police had more than enough evidence to arrest Christopher and bring the case to court. The drug dealer who actually pulled the trigger and literally killed Susan cut a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. As for Christopher, who actually was the mastermind behind all of this, he was convicted of murder and attempted murder and sentenced to 3 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2023, Christopher's father and would-be murder victim, John Sutton, continues to give money to experimental research programs that have the goal of giving people who have gone blind the chance to see again. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Late at night on August 15th, 2019, two police officers in England were driving in an unmarked police car along this narrow, winding road when all of a sudden, right in front of them, another car came bombing down the road towards them. And so both cars came to a screeching stop, and then one occupant from this other car got out of their vehicle, and one of the officers got out of their vehicle. What happened next was so horrific that a special law was passed to make sure it never happened again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please ask the Amazon Music follow button if you can borrow some of their best Tupperware. When they say yes, immediately stain them orange with spaghetti sauce. Okay, let's get into today's story. On July 18th, 2019, 28-year-old Andrew Harper scrawled a little note inside of a card, and then he folded the card up, he slipped it into its envelope, and he handed that envelope off to a nearby friend. And this friend, after getting this envelope and Andrew's directions for what to do with it, he left Andrew's room and began walking down the hall all the way towards the other side of the Ardington house. The Ardington house, where they were staying, is this beautiful mansion built in the 1700s that sits on about 30 acres of gardens and parklands, and it's located about an hour west of London in the English countryside. Once Andrew's friend, with this letter in hand, had walked all the way across the mansion and had found the room he was looking for, he gently knocked on the door, and then after being led inside, he made his way right over to 28-year-old Lissy Beckett, and he handed her the envelope. Lissy and Andrew had grown up in the same town of Wallingford, which is a small rural town about 10 miles away from where they were, the Ardington house. And from the time Lissy and Andrew had met each other when they were 15 years old, they had become totally inseparable. It was truly love at first sight. And now, 13 years later, they were finally getting married. And so Lissy, after getting this envelope, she saw the writing on the outside of it and knew it was from her fiancé. And so she smiled, she opens up this letter, and she reads what's inside. And it just said, "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." While on the surface, this little note seemed like nothing more than a romantic gesture from Andrew, in reality, those 7 words contained in that card were a great representation of who Andrew really was. He was a protector. Ever since Lissy could remember, Andrew had always been so concerned with her safety. And for that matter, anybody around Andrew was just worried about and wanted to make sure everybody was taken care of. And as Andrew got older and grew to be this massive 6'5" tall man, his natural inclination to protect other people only became more pronounced. While Andrew was known for being incredibly charming and friendly and approachable, at a moment's notice, he could flip the switch and literally step in and use his big frame to protect anybody that needed protecting, no questions asked. And so it came as no shock to Lissy or really anybody who knew Andrew when Andrew, at the age of 19, became a special constable or volunteer police officer for the Thames Valley Police Department. This police department was the same one that oversaw Wallingford, where he and Lissy had grown up, and also the surrounding areas. And just a year after becoming a special constable, Andrew had done such an amazing job that he was hired on by the Thames Valley Police Department to be a regular constable, so a full-fledged police officer. And over the following years that he was a regular constable, Andrew's hard work and dedication would quickly make him one of the most well-respected and well-liked police officers on the force. In fact, just a few weeks before he sent off that letter to Lissy on the day of their wedding, Andrew had been promoted. He had been assigned to the road policing unit within the Thames Valley Police Department, and what that meant was, in addition to a host of new responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, Andrew would now become one of the police officers who would immediately respond to any emergency call that came in. He was basically a front lines police officer now. And so, of course, this meant Andrew's job just became a lot more dangerous, but for Andrew, that didn't matter at all, because to him, the most important thing was protecting people in need. And so this promotion just gave him a bigger opportunity to do that. And so Lissy, after reading this little note that Andrew had just sent her, she set it down on the table, and now with a big grin on her face, she finished getting ready, and then that afternoon, she and Andrew would walk down the aisle, and they would say, "I do," in front of their families and their closest friends, and then that evening, after the newlyweds had had their first dance as a married couple, they would tell each other that this was the happiest day of their lives. 28 days later, on August 15th, Andrew, along with his partner, who also was named Andrew, his name was Andrew Shaw, they were conducting a surveillance operation in a town called Reading. Reading is a town about 30 minutes south of Wallingford. Just after 11 p.m., the men finally decided it was time to shut down their operation and head back home. Their shift had actually ended 4 hours earlier, but being hardworking and diligent police officers, they had worked overtime because they knew it would help their unit. But now at 11 p.m., they were totally exhausted, and so as they're kind of yawning and packing up their things, Shaw, who was driving, would fire up the engine of the unmarked BMW car they were in, and then once it was on, he would pull away from the curb, and they would start heading north. At the same time, a very distressed man who lived not far from where Andrew and Shaw had just been doing surveillance, he called 999 and he told the dispatcher that just a few moments ago, this gray sedan had pulled up his driveway and stopped right outside of his property. Now, this man's property was off of a road called Admore Lane, which was this winding one-lane country road that had very little traffic, and there was not that many properties off of it. And so for anybody to pull on to this man's property would have caught his attention, let alone a car pulling onto his property in the middle of the night. And so as soon as the man had seen these headlights coming up his driveway, he had gone to the window and watched, wondering, what is this person doing? Had they turned onto the wrong property? Are they going to turn around and leave? But to his horror, once this car had stopped right outside of his house, 3 masked men who were carrying weapons of some kind got out of the vehicle. And so at that point, the man had frantically dialed 999, and as he's trying to describe the situation to the dispatcher, he suddenly tells the dispatcher as he's looking out the window that he thinks these men are here to steal his quad bike. His quad bike was parked right outside of his detached garage, and he saw them walking towards it. And so he tells the dispatcher, who's already told him that police are on the way, he tells the dispatcher, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going out to confront them and stop them from stealing my bike." The dispatcher yells at him not to and says, "They have weapons, stay in your house," but this guy's not listening, and so he runs to his front door, he opens the front door up, but by the time he's looking outside, the gray car, the 3 masked men, they're all gone, and so too is his quad bike. And so he goes back in the house, he's talking to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher says, "Look, just stay at your house, the police are on the way, they will intercept that car, they'll get your quad bike back." And so seconds later, a call went out over the radio to Thames Valley Police to go and intercept this gray car on Admore Lane. So whoever was closest, go over there, but be advised, the occupants of this car are 3 masked men that are armed and dangerous. Now, Andrew and Shaw, when they heard this call, they would have known that they were not the only officers that could have taken this call. And they also would have known that they've been off the clock now for like 4.5 hours. There was no expectation that they would continue to work and go take this call. But they didn't care at all. When that call came across, the only thing they thought about was, do your job. And so Shaw, he whips the car around and he speeds towards Admore Lane and he pulls off of the main road called the A4. He gets onto Admore Lane and he starts driving north. Now, as soon as they turned onto that road, their vehicle effectively blocked the way for anybody coming the other direction. And so at this point, they're expecting this gray car full of these masked men to be coming in their direction, and they are now blocking the way. And so Andrew and Shaw, as soon as they get on that road, they know a close quarters confrontation is almost guaranteed. But when you listen to the dashcam footage from the front of their vehicle that picked up the voices of Andrew and Shaw as they turn onto this road, there is no nerves, there's no fear, there's no hesitation. They are calm as can be. This is what they have trained for. They were ready. And so Shaw, he's making his way up this winding road. It's totally pitch black. The trees are practically on top of the road. It's like a tunnel of trees. And so they're driving along this road, and then all of a sudden, up in the distance, you can see on the dash cam footage, you see headlights bombing toward them. They're way off in the distance, and then all of a sudden, that car, these headlights, they come flooring out right in front of them, and both cars come to a screeching stop. You can hear the screeching of the brakes on the dash cam footage. And so this car in front of them comes to a full stop, and Shaw, he stops, but then he moves up just a little bit closer before fully stopping the car. And so now the two cars are only maybe 10 or 15 feet apart. At this point, it's important to understand that the vehicle that Shaw and Andrew were in was an unmarked car, and they had intentionally not put on their blue lights as they're cruising up this road because they didn't want the suspects to see the blue lights in the distance and turn around and get away. And so now they've come face to face, and so Andrew and Shaw, they're looking at this vehicle, and they can see that one, it's a gray sedan, so it matches the description of the car they're looking for, and two, behind this gray sedan is what looks like a quad bike that they are towing. And so they know this is the car they were looking for. It's on Admore Lane. This has got to be it. And so Shaw, he flips on the blue lights, and Andrew, who's in the passenger seat, he opens the door and begins yelling at the occupants to stay where they are. But they don't listen. Because now, the masked men in the gray car, they know they've been caught. There's police right in front of them. And so suddenly, one of the masked men in the back seat of this car, he leaps out of the vehicle and he runs around to the back of the gray car and he unhooks the quad bike. And then the gray car, without even waiting for this third masked man to get back inside, it just begins driving forward on the left side of Shaw and Andrew, basically trying to drive around them, despite the fact there's nowhere to drive. It's a ditch on either side of the road. But obviously, these guys are desperate and willing to do anything to get away. And so this gray car has driven down into this ditch before Andrew and Shaw could do anything. And then the third masked man, who's realizing he's being left behind, he starts running around the right side of the police car. So he's trying to go around the other way. And amazingly, as soon as the third masked man made it around to the back of the police car, the gray car somehow managed to pop out of the ditch and got back onto the road, and it starts driving away from Shaw and Andrew. And as they're driving away, the third masked man is just on the road running after them. And so Andrew, seeing an opportunity to potentially grab this third masked man that was out on foot, he jumps out of the police car, he turns, and starts running down the road after the suspects. And so Shaw, he doesn't have enough space on this road to turn around and drive after them. And so all he could do was put the car into reverse and then look over his shoulder and start driving in reverse after them. And so as Shaw is driving backwards down this road, he can see out of his rear window Andrew, who is chasing the third masked man, who is chasing the gray car. And so we can see all this happening out his back window. And then something totally strange that just defied logic happened. The third masked man suddenly leaps as if he's trying to jump into the moving car. And at the same time, Andrew, who's closed the distance on him, kind of lunges for the third masked man. And then just as suddenly as these two maneuvers have happened, both men just vanish, and then the gray car just drives away and disappears. And so Shaw, he's watching this happening and he has no idea what he's just witnessed. He's thinking, where did Andrew go? Where'd the third masked man go? What's happened? But he still can only drive in reverse, and so he's just driving, and then finally he reaches a point in the road that's just wide enough that he's able to turn the car around, and as he's doing that, you hear over dispatch that someone is asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And all Shaw is able to say is, my partner, Andrew, has gotten out of the vehicle, and I lost him. I don't know where he is. And so after Shaw has turned the vehicle around, he begins driving, now facing the proper direction. And as he's driving down this creepy dark road, you don't see anything. It's eerily quiet. Andrew's nowhere to be found. The car is nowhere to be found. The third masked man, there's no one. And so Shaw is just driving down the road, hoping that as he makes one turn or the next, he's gonna see his partner just kind of running on the road somewhere, but he doesn't. But as he's driving along, what Shaw didn't realize was that there were things in the road that belonged to Andrew. They were kind of small, so he didn't see them, but the footage would later reveal that it was almost like there was this trail of Andrew's things kind of littered all over the road. There was his wallet, and there was his badge, and there was his license and other ID cards, and then there was his glove, and then there was this piece of plastic that looked like it belonged on Andrew's vest. And then a little farther down the road, because Shaw is still driving and scanning for his partner and scanning for anything, and there's just nothing. As he's driving along, he would, in real time, notice something of Andrew's, and it was Andrew's stab vest that he wore over his chest. And so he stops the vehicle and he gets out, and again, he's on this totally pitch black road where it's weirdly quiet, and he's walking up and he grabs the vest, he comes back into his vehicle and he puts it down inside of his car. And at this point, over the radio, people are asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And you hear in Shaw's voice a bit of panic as he's like, I've found Andrew's stab vest. It was on the side of the road, and he can't make sense of that. He has no idea why it's there. And dispatch, they don't know what to make of that. And so Shaw just continued driving down this road, thinking to himself, what's happening here? Meanwhile, less than a mile away at the end of Admore Lane, where it joined up with A4, which is where Andrew and Shaw had originally come in, 2 other Thames Valley police cars had arrived at that intersection. They had gone there specifically to try to intercept this gray car as they fled. And so they're sitting at this intersection and they're looking up Admore Lane and they see headlights bombing towards them. It's the gray car, and the gray car comes speeding out onto A4. It makes a hard turn and it speeds away from these 2 police cars. And so one of these 2 police cars that were waiting out on the A4, one of them takes off following the gray car. But the other police car, they stay right there, because unbelievably, they had just spotted Andrew. It would turn out when Shaw first put the BMW into reverse and he began going in reverse towards his partner who was chasing the third masked man who was chasing the gray car, when he was doing that and he was watching out his back window and he saw the third masked man jump and then disappear and then Andrew disappeared, that was not a figment of his imagination. That really happened. The third masked man had attempted to jump into the moving vehicle, and he had been successful. As for Andrew, why he suddenly vanished, the reason for that is truly horrific. The 3 masked men were 18-year-old Henry Long and 17-year-olds Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole. All 3 of them, prior to this night, had fairly extensive criminal records, and they proudly referred to themselves as career thieves, which basically just meant they spent all day and all night stealing from people. And so that night, they had gone out with the intention of stealing that man's quad bike. It's unclear how they knew he had a quad bike, but they definitely showed up prepared because they knew they would have to get onto his property and very quickly tow that bike out of there before the homeowner could stop them. And so they had attached this long, very thick rope to the back of their gray car. It was basically like this big loop of rope, almost like a lasso. And so when they pulled up onto that man's property, they backed up to the quad bike and they looped that stretch of rope over the handlebars of this quad bike. And then all 3 of them piled back into the gray car and they sped off with the quad bike in tow. But when they were on Admore Lane and came face to face with Andrew and Shaw and realized those are police officers and were caught, the third masked man, aka Jesse Cole, he hopped out of the gray car, he ran around to the back, and he unhooked the loop of rope from this quad bike, ditching the quad bike by the side of the road so that it would be easier for the gray car to make their getaway. And so once it was free, the gray car kind of took off without Jesse. And so Jesse ran around the cop car, but Jesse would get back up to the side of the gray car and he would leap into the window. And as soon as he was inside, and Henry, who was driving, he knew he was inside, so they're all good, Henry hit the gas. And who was standing with both feet inside of that loop of rope dangling off the back of the gray car when the gray car suddenly accelerated? Andrew Harper.
Andrew was swept off of his feet as the rope grabbed onto his legs, and so his head came back and smashed into the ground, and then he was dragged for 91 seconds at an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour down Ardmore Lane. It was only after he had been dragged for over a mile, whipping violently side to side, smashing not only into the ground but into trees and fence posts and shrubs, just getting destroyed on this road, that finally when they pulled off of Ardmore Lane and got onto A4, that turn swung Andrew around and he smashed into a curb that dislodged him from the rope and sent him careening into traffic. At that point, one of those two police cars took off after the gray car in pursuit. But the other car, they saw Andrew as he was thrown off the back of the gray car and launched onto A4. Now, initially, they actually thought that the suspects were just hauling a dead deer behind them because it looked like a bloody deer carcass was dangling behind the car. But when they ran up to see what it was, they saw it was their colleague. It was Andrew. And so immediately they tried to save his life, but Andrew's injuries were catastrophic. He had been destroyed. And so Andrew Harper would die at 11:45 p.m. on the side of the A4, about 20 minutes after he and his partner had so selflessly agreed to go after this car despite the fact they didn't have to. The three killers were arrested about 1 hour after Andrew had died. A police helicopter had spotted their car parked amongst some buildings about 4 miles away from where Andrew was found. During their trial, the three teens would say they had no idea that Andrew was attached to that tow rope as they sped down Ardmore Lane. This is despite the fact that the prosecution, they went out and recreated the exact scene that played out on Ardmore Lane. They used the same car, they used the same tow rope, and they used a very lifelike dummy that was the same size as Andrew Harper. It was 6'5", 200 pounds, and they strapped it on the back of the car, and they drove the same mile stretch to see what it would be like to drive with Andrew attached to the back. And these experts that went through this recreation over and over and over again, they said the same thing. It was nearly impossible to drive the car because as soon as the dummy would start to shift one way or the other, it would tug and pull on this little gray car. And so handling this car would have been a nightmare, not to mention the fact that the sound of Andrew grinding against the cement and smashing into trees and posts would have been extremely loud. And so the prosecution attested that there was absolutely no way that those three teens wouldn't have known that there was a person connected to the back of their car. Also, the prosecution said that all along Ardmore Lane, they found blood on both sides of the road, high up into bushes and on trees, indicating that as Henry had driven along with Andrew behind him, he must have been swerving violently side to side, most likely, at least according to the prosecution, to try to dislodge the person that was stuck on the back of his car. But the three teens never changed their story. They also never once said they regretted what they did. They showed absolutely no remorse. And when the verdict was read, and these three teens were not found guilty of murder, they were found guilty of manslaughter, but everybody knew that was significantly better because the sentences were so much shorter. When that verdict came back, these three teens were punching the air and cheering and laughing, just making a complete spectacle out of it. And then after being led out of the courthouse with the devastated family of Andrew Harper basically watching them, they were smirking and smiling at the cameras and waving and just treating the whole thing like it was one big joke. Still to this day, none of them have apologized or expressed any regret or remorse about what happened. In fact, two of the killers, Jesse and Albert, they've come out publicly and said they're going to write a book about this crime, about killing Andrew Harper, and there's no indication that this book is being written because they feel bad. It's almost certainly being written because it's an opportunity to make money. Following the verdict, Andrew's wife, Lissy, who was totally devastated not only by the loss of her husband, but also by what she viewed as total injustice with regards to the fact that these three killers had not been convicted of murder, she would go on to lobby for years to pass a brand new law called Harper's Law that would give an automatic life sentence to any criminal that killed an emergency worker while they were committing a crime. Meaning this law would not differentiate between whether it was manslaughter or murder. If you killed an emergency worker while committing a crime, you're going to jail for life. And this year, Harper's Law was passed. However, it will have no effect on the sentences of Andrew Harper's killers. Henry would be sentenced to 16 years in prison, and the other two, Albert and Jesse, would be sentenced to 13 years in prison each. All three of them will be eligible for parole by the time they are 28 years old, which is the same age that Andrew was when they killed him. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the Amazon Music follow button if you can borrow some of their best Tupperware. When they say yes, immediately stain them orange with spaghetti sauce. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime, as well as the victims' families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. On the afternoon of September 10th, 2009, an art student walked inside of her off-campus apartment in Dallas, Texas, and immediately began making herself a late lunch. Her roommate didn't come out of the bedroom to greet her, but to be honest, this wasn't totally unusual. The two of them, despite being roommates, were not actually very close at all. After eating their food, the student studied for a while, and then watched some TV, and then went to bed. All the while, still never hearing a sound coming out of her roommate's bedroom. But again, this was normal. That is, until the next day, when the student received a call from their school telling her to go back to her apartment to check on her roommate, because apparently the roommate's mother was very concerned about them. The student was annoyed, but went back to the apartment, and when they walked into their roommate's bedroom, they would see something that would haunt them for years. And it would instantly explain why their roommate had not come out of the room. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to change the oil in the follow button's car, but be sure you replace their oil with vegetable oil. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Wednesday, September 9th, 2009, 20-year-old Shelley Nance walked into her bedroom inside of her off-campus apartment in Dallas, Texas, and then shut the door behind her. Shelley liked the fact that once inside of her room, she would not need to speak to anybody. She preferred it that way. She settled down on her bed with her back propped against a stack of pillows, and then she took out her notebook and pencil and began to draw. Shelley spent most of her time drawing on a computer at the Art Institute of Dallas, where she was a second-year multimedia and animation student. But when she was by herself and just wanted to relax, she preferred just using pencil and paper. Tonight, Shelley began sketching a young woman who looked a lot like herself, slender with long flowing hair, and just the hint of a smile on her face. Shelley originally began drawing to escape the boredom of growing up in the tiny town of Italy, Texas, where she'd always been something of a loner. She even joked about that in her senior yearbook, choosing a biting quote to go with her picture. She wrote, "You laugh at me because I'm different. I laugh at you because you're all the same." But Shelley got so good at drawing that it actually changed her life. She eventually won an art competition that gave her a partial scholarship to this art institute, And suddenly, Shelley had a plan for life after high school, to be an artist. As soon as she got to the art school and started meeting her eccentric and creative classmates, Shelley felt like she'd finally found her place. For the first time ever, she had friends who actually understood and accepted her quirks. They would go to anime conventions together and even dress up as their favorite anime characters. It was a world that Shelley frankly never could have imagined back in her hometown, which was basically no more than a truck stop along a highway. And going to this art institute provided another big first for Shelley. She had a boyfriend, Nathan Shuck, and they often could be found playing video games together on the couch at his apartment. But as Shelley sat there sketching tiny doves into her picture, she realized that having this active social life now could actually be kind of a burden. Until recently, she had never had to consider anybody else's feelings but her own, but now having a boyfriend meant she had to plan for two people. And after dating Nathan for 2 months now, she was actually starting to have her doubts about the relationship. She thought Nathan was a good person, but deep down, she knew she didn't feel about him the way he felt about her. Now, she didn't want to hurt his feelings, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel really strongly that she kind of just wanted to break up with him. She just had no idea how to actually tell him. Shelley put her pencil down and closed her sketch pad, hoping for a new distraction, and she found one after she hopped on her computer and went on a popular website looking at other artists' work. And Shelley's thoughts very quickly kind of drifted away from Nathan and the seemingly imminent, unpleasant conversation that she was going to have with him. After a while, Shelley looked up at the clock, and she was shocked to see that it was already 6 a.m. She'd been up all night. She really needed to get some rest before her classes that afternoon. So she left her room to make sure the front door was locked, then she went back to her bedroom, closed the door, crawled back into bed, and drifted off to sleep. A little more than 24 hours later, at 7 a.m. on Friday, September 11th, Shelley's mother, Cynthia, woke up in a motel in Colorado. She and her husband were a little over halfway through their 22-hour drive to Yellowstone National Park, which was like their dream trip. While they raised their 3 girls, they barely ever left their small town in Texas. But now that Shelley, their youngest, was settled in college, they'd finally decided to take the plunge and go do this big trip. When they'd hit the road Thursday morning, Cynthia sent a text message to all 3 of the girls, and Shelley was the only one who didn't text back. But Cynthia was not that worried about it, because Shelley was a night owl and she often slept during the day when everybody else was up and about. But Shelley would usually call at some point after she woke up for class, except this time, she didn't. And so Cynthia had called one of Shelley's sisters to say she was worried, but the sister thought their mother was just overreacting. And so she told her mom, hey, remember, she's an adult. She's a 20-year-old woman who's allowed to have a social life. In fact, her sister was happy that maybe Shelley the homebody was out somewhere having fun for once. At 9 a.m. that same morning, Cynthia and her husband went for a scenic ride through the Colorado Rockies. But Cynthia barely noticed any of it, because she still hadn't heard from Shelley, and she just had this gut feeling that something was actually wrong. And so as they drove through this beautiful area, Cynthia grabbed her phone and called Shelley's school. A school administrator answered the call, but she sounded annoyed at Cynthia's request. She said they just didn't have the resources to send somebody out to check on every student who didn't call their parents right on time. Cynthia knew she was coming off like an overprotective mother, but she also knew it was completely unlike Shelley to ignore her messages for this long. So Cynthia practically begged the administrator to please check later that day and just see if her daughter made it to class. The administrator sighed and said she'd wait for a break between classes and see if someone could track Shelley down. Around noon that day, Shelley's roommate, Ashley Alvera, grumpily made her way up the stairs towards their apartment. Someone from the school administration had stopped Ashley when she was leaving class and asked her to just stop what she was doing and go back to her apartment and check on her roommate, Shelley, make sure she's okay. Apparently, Shelley's parents were looking for her, and she wasn't returning any calls or texts. But Ashley thought this request was totally ridiculous. Shelley's parents did not need to know where Shelley was 24/7. She was an adult. And so now Ashley felt like her time was being wasted. But nonetheless, she made it upstairs to the apartment, she unlocked the door, and walked inside. And once she was inside the apartment, she noticed the door to Shelley's bedroom was closed, as usual, and so she walked over and knocked, and she didn't get an answer. Then she called out Shelley's name, but she was met with more silence, so Ashley opened the door. And there in bed was Shelley, lying face down under the blanket. And so Ashley quickly went from feeling annoyed at this to now just feeling angry. She'd come all the way back to the apartment to check on her roommate just to find out Shelley had been sleeping all day. So Ashley walked over and kind of gruffly told Shelley, "Hey, wake up, your parents are looking for you." But Shelley didn't move. Ashley sighed and walked back over to the door and flipped on the light in the room, but when the lights were now on, Shelley didn't react. And so now, feeling sort of on edge, Ashley walked back over to the bed and gently shook Shelley, but Shelley didn't move. And also, Shelley's arm felt cold to the touch. And that's when Ashley just grabbed the blanket and pulled it back, and she saw Shelley's sheets were soaked in blood. Absolutely horrified, Ashley screamed Shelley's name over and over again, but Shelley wasn't moving or making any sound, and so Ashley turned and ran out of the room to call 911. Not long after that 911 call, the school called Cynthia back and began to tell her what was going on. They told her her daughter had been found in her room, she was covered in blood, and then before the caller from the school could explain further, Cynthia's cell phone just went dead. The reception in the Colorado mountains where they were was terrible, and so she had just dropped service. And so Cynthia, who's heard this terrible thing about her daughter, began frantically trying to call back, but she just couldn't get any service. And so Cynthia shouted at her husband to turn the car around and keep driving until she got better phone reception. Her husband immediately did a U-turn and hit the gas, making the tires squeal, and then just as suddenly as Cynthia had lost service, she suddenly had service again. And so she screamed at her husband to stop the car so she could call them back. And so Cynthia, whose hand was now shaking, finally got through to the Art Institute and breathlessly asked them if her daughter was okay. And the woman on the other end said she was so sorry, but Shelley was dead. Police were investigating right now, but it appeared her daughter had been murdered. Cynthia and her husband just sat there in silence in the middle of nowhere, absorbing the worst news a parent can possibly receive. Cynthia felt this desperate urge to do something, visit Shelley's apartment, talk to detectives, or just be there to comfort their other daughters. But they had no choice but to just start driving again because it was going to take them nearly a day to drive all the way back to Texas. At about the same time that Cynthia and her husband got this terrible news, Detective Paul Elzy placed a fan belt and motor oil on the checkout counter at a Dallas auto shop. He was heading out to his farm in East Texas that weekend and was looking forward to doing some maintenance on his tractor. And just as he finished paying, his phone rang. It was his partner. His partner said they had a murder to solve, and it was a tough one. A young art student had been stabbed to death in her bed with no witnesses, and so far, no evidence. Suddenly, Elzy knew he was not going to be spending time at his farm. So he left the auto shop, got into his car, and drove across town to Shelley's apartment complex. Elzy walked up the stairs to Shelley's apartment and stepped inside. And already it was flooded with evidence technicians who were dusting for fingerprints and snapping photos. Elzy's partner greeted him and quickly got him up to speed. The victim's roommate discovered the body around noon, but she said she didn't know anything else because she'd been away at class all morning. Unfortunately, the technicians had not found anything useful so far. No fingerprints, shoe prints, or hairs near the body that could give police some clues to who the killer was. Detective Elzy thanked his partner for the update and said he wanted to take his own look around the small apartment to see if anything stood out. Elzy was a seasoned homicide detective with 36 years on the force. He saw each case as a challenge, a puzzle he would need to solve, and sometimes the pieces did just kind of fall into place. Inside the apartment, he noticed the TV and some other fairly expensive electronic equipment were still there. Also, the windows weren't broken, and there didn't appear to be any signs of forced entry. So this didn't seem like a robbery. More likely, Elzy thought, the victim let the killer into their apartment, or the killer had a key. Elzy walked into the bathroom next to Shelley's bedroom and realized why there was so little blood tracked around the apartment. He could see a spot of blood on the edge of the sink, as well as a few spots on the edge of the tub. The killer had clearly tried to clean themselves up after committing the murder, and so whoever killed Shelley had thought this crime through and potentially had really thought through how to get away with it. Elzy then headed to the bedroom to look at the victim. Shelley was lying on her stomach on the bed in a shirt and underwear. Her back and neck were covered in wounds, and her long reddish-brown hair was now matted with dried blood. Elzy had seen countless bodies over his long career, and he usually kept a very cool professional distance from the victims' lives. But he was not prepared for what lay before him now. The murder was gruesome, but that wasn't what unsettled him. It was Shelley herself. She was the same age as one of Elzy's daughters, and he suddenly felt like he was looking at his own child lying there, covered in blood. Elsie composed himself and leaned over the bed and looked more closely at the condition of Shelley's body. He couldn't even count the number of stab wounds in her neck and back, but there didn't seem to be wounds anywhere else, including her hands and arms. The lack of defensive wounds made Elsie think that Shelley had not put up much of a fight against her attacker. Plus, all the blood seemed to be concentrated on the bed, while the rest of the bedroom looked basically undisturbed, as though Shelley never had a chance to get up. So maybe she was asleep when this happened. Shelley's clothes were still on and relatively undisturbed, making Elsie think she had not been sexually assaulted as well. But looking at her battered body, Elsie saw a killer that must have been filled with rage, and this rage-filled killer clearly had ready access to this apartment. And so the detective felt certain that Shelley must have been killed by someone she knew who must have had a very personal and serious problem with her. Later on that day, sometime in the afternoon, the medical examiner provided a more detailed picture of what actually killed Shelley. Both her carotid artery and her jugular vein, which are in her neck, were severed, and her esophagus and trachea had been punctured, as well as one of her lungs. And so Shelley had suffered multiple wounds that on their own would have killed her, but she had several of these fatal wounds. Yet beyond the savage attack on Shelley's upper body, there were basically no other injuries. Not only were there no additional stab wounds, the medical examiner also concluded that Shelley had not been sexually assaulted. And the killer left behind almost no obvious physical clues, except perhaps one. As the medical examiner was swabbing under Shelley's fingernails in hopes that maybe she might have scratched her killer, he spotted a blue speck under Shelley's left wrist. It looked like nothing more than a tiny piece of plastic, but it was the only physical evidence the killer seemed to have left behind. So he had sent it off to the lab to be tested. Detective Elsie was interviewing Shelley's roommate, Ashley, at the police station when he heard a knock at the door, and one of the officers handed him the autopsy results. Elsie stepped into the hallway outside of the interview room and quickly scanned over the report for highlights, and one finding jumped off the page at him. From the condition of Shelley's body, the medical examiner estimated that she had been dead for up to 24 hours by the time Ashley found her. Elsie was startled. He had assumed that Shelley must have been killed no more than a few hours before Ashley found her, but now the medical examiner was saying that the murder most likely happened a full day earlier, sometime on Thursday, not Friday. And this cast the murder into a whole new light. And so Elsie went back into the interview room with lots of new questions for Ashley. It dawned on Elsie that if Ashley's story was to be believed, that meant Ashley had been living with the corpse of a roommate for the better part of a full day. Ashley had said that she and Shelley were really never friends, they were just roommates, and it wasn't uncommon for them to go days without seeing each other. In fact, Ashley had already told Elsie that the last time she had seen Shelley was Wednesday morning before she'd left for class, so 48 hours before Shelley had been found. But despite that, Elsie really just wanted to know where Ashley was all day on Thursday when she apparently didn't see her roommate at all. Ashley told him she'd left for class at 9 a.m. that day and then come back to the apartment at 3 p.m. And for the rest of the day, Ashley said she stayed at the apartment, eating dinner, doing homework, and then going to bed. Elsie's eyebrows shot up, and he held up the autopsy results. And then he told Ashley that the report showed her roommate had been killed earlier than police realized initially. He told her that if what she was saying was true, she'd gone about her business in their small apartment for 18 hours with a dead body in the next room. How was that possible? But Ashley only seemed confused, like she couldn't quite process the information she had just been given. She said she really didn't know what he was talking about, but the detective thought that just wasn't good enough. Elsie pointed out that the roommates shared a single bathroom, and that investigators found blood on the sink and in the bathtub. How could Ashley possibly have missed the blood? Didn't it make her worry about her roommate? At that point, Ashley began to cry. She did see the blood, but it was only a few spots, so she didn't think Shelley was hurt in any serious way. But still, Elsie was not persuaded. He thought there was more going on here than Ashley was saying. So he asked her, was there any problem between them? Ashley insisted that they'd only had minor disagreements, just girl stuff, she said. The detective wondered what that meant exactly, and so he said, were they fighting over the same love interest or something? But Ashley swore that never happened. Shelley had a boyfriend, Nathan, and Ashley was not interested in him at all. In fact, Ashley said she had very little contact with Nathan, and she kind of liked it that way. Friends of hers told her that Nathan actually had a really bad temper. He apparently loved playing video games so much that if something went bad for him in the game, he would just totally lose his cool and explode. Detective Elsie thought Ashley's answers still seemed off. In fact, they were so far off that Elsie started to see Ashley as a suspect. After all, who would have had easier access to the apartment than Shelley's own roommate? But Elsie decided to try a new tactic, and he asked Ashley, was there anybody else besides her who had a key to this apartment? And Ashley told him that besides her and Shelley, no one else did. At this point, Detective Elsie couldn't help but feel convinced that Ashley must have had something to do with Shelley's death. If Ashley had the only other key, well, then she was either directly responsible, or perhaps she was the one who let the killer into the apartment. He didn't know which it was, but based on how nervous Ashley looked at this moment, he had a pretty good idea how to find out. So he just came out and accused Ashley outright of the murder. He told her to confess, and that things would actually be much easier for her if she did. But Ashley just stared back at the detective in total disbelief and began to cry again. For the next couple of hours, Detective Elsie tried to wear Ashley down, hoping for a confession that would wrap up the case. But Ashley did not change her story, and she never confessed to anything. By Saturday, September 12th, after an excruciating, mentally torturous journey, Shelley's parents finally arrived back in Texas and went to meet with Detective Elsie. When they came into the station, Elsie thought they looked like they hadn't slept the entire drive back, and he knew they were obviously grieving. But he did need to talk to them right now regardless of their condition. Their answers could be the key to finding out who killed their daughter. And so the first question he asked them was, were there any problems between Shelley and her roommate Ashley that they were aware of? Her parents seemed surprised by the question. They said their daughter and her roommate Ashley weren't exactly good friends, but they certainly didn't have any major problems that they knew of. Elsie followed up by asking if they could think of anyone who might want to hurt Shelley. Did she have any enemies? But her parents said that Shelley had always been a bit of a homebody who kept to herself, and because she didn't really go out much, there wasn't any drama in her life and very little opportunity to make enemies. Cynthia said that of their 3 daughters, Shelley was the easiest to raise. She never drank alcohol or did drugs, stayed out late, or got into trouble. After that, Detective Elsie asked them what Shelley's boyfriend, Nathan, was like. Shelley's mom said they'd never met him since they'd only been dating for a couple of months. The only thing Shelley had said about Nathan was that her dad probably wouldn't like him, but it was just because he had a lip piercing and tattoos. However, Cynthia did tell the detective that a couple of weeks ago, Shelley had called her to ask how to break up with her boyfriend, Nathan. Cynthia had given her some advice, but after that, she had no idea if Shelley actually had broken up with him or not. Now, Elsie needed to know whether Shelley had followed through and ended that relationship with Nathan. If the guy had a hot temper, as Shelley's roommate claimed, a bad breakup, in theory, could be enough to send him into a rage. Later that day, when Elsie walked into the interrogation room to speak to Nathan for the first time, he was surprised to see Nathan's appearance. Even though he had tattoos and a piercing, he was really just kind of a skinny kid. And the way he was sitting in the chair seemed so childlike. He had pulled his feet up onto the seat and was kind of clutching his knees close to his chest the way a child would. But Elsie knew looks could be deceiving, so right away, he asked where Nathan had been on Thursday, the day of Shelley's murder. Nathan said he'd been staying at his mother's house that week, and he had slept there on Wednesday night. On Thursday morning, his mother had dropped him off at the school at around 9 a.m., but he didn't have school until 3. The detective couldn't believe what Nathan had just told him. He had just admitted that he had this big window of time on the day Shelley was murdered that was basically unaccounted for. Nathan told the detective that all he had done that day was homework in the computer lab during the 6 hours before his 3 p.m. class, but Elsie was sure that Nathan had left at some point for some amount of time, maybe to go to the bathroom or maybe to get something to eat, something. He just felt like 6 hours sitting in the same spot doing homework nonstop sounded sort of unlikely for even the most diligent of students. But Elsie kept that to himself and just asked Nathan if he had a key to Shelley's apartment. But Nathan said he didn't. Elsie asked him why not. If Nathan was her boyfriend, wouldn't Shelley give him a key? But Nathan said they'd only been dating a couple of months, and really their relationship was not that serious. They hadn't had sex. In fact, they hadn't even kissed. He told the detective the only thing they'd ever done that was sort of intimate was hold hands. Elsie was convinced that Nathan had to be downplaying his relationship with Shelley to kind of make himself seem less culpable. I mean, after all, what college couple didn't do anything more than hold hands if they've been dating for a couple of months? I mean, it just seemed kind of unrealistic. But Nathan swore that really was the truth, and he insisted that holding hands was actually a really big deal for both of them. At this point, the detective realized he was likely dealing with a very sheltered and somewhat awkward kid. But he also knew about Nathan's reputation for having a really bad temper, and so maybe he could get Nathan to show it by catching him off guard. So the detective directly confronted him. He asked Nathan how he felt when Shelley broke up with him. Was he angry? Did he lose control? Is that what happened? But Nathan didn't seem angry at all. He seemed confused. He said he didn't know what the detective was talking about because Shelley had not broken up with him. Elsie told Nathan he was lying. He knew from Shelley's mother that Shelley definitely wanted to break up with him, and he told Nathan his new theory. Shelley must have ended their relationship, and Nathan had been so upset he had flown into a rage and killed Shelley. But to Elsie's surprise, instead of protesting his innocence, Nathan barely reacted. He just sat there staring. Elsie asked him, "What are you thinking about?" And Nathan just said he felt sort of numb, that he didn't know how to react, that this felt like a bad dream he was just hoping to wake up from. Following a hunch, Elsie then asked Nathan to lift up his shirt. Nathan did what he was told and stood and lifted it up, and the detective could see visible scratches on his chest. Elsie immediately wondered if maybe he got those scratches from Shelley as she tried to fight off her attacker, maybe at first, because he knew she didn't put up much of a fight, but maybe she put up a little bit of a fight and that was it. But Nathan said no, he got those scratches actually from scratching himself. He said he didn't kill his girlfriend and he really had nothing to hide. At this point, Elsie saw an opening. If that was true, that Nathan had nothing to hide, would he let detectives search his apartment right now? Nathan said, yeah, go ahead, they wouldn't find anything. And so, a little while later that day, Elsie and some other investigators followed Nathan up the steps to his off-campus apartment. When they got to the door, Nathan unlocked it and let them inside. Elsie told Nathan to wait by the front door, and he had a detective stay with him. Elsie didn't want Nathan to interfere. When Elsie got inside the apartment, the first thing he noticed was the apartment was incredibly clean. He'd been inside a fair number of college apartments, and typically, they were a mess. He turned to Nathan and asked him, why is this place so immaculate? Had he cleaned it up recently, hoping to hide evidence? But Nathan said that he had nothing to do with how the apartment looked. His roommate was a total neat freak who couldn't bear the sight of dirty dishes or things lying around the house. Nathan said his roommate even cleaned up after him. Elsie nodded and then asked which room was Nathan's. Nathan raised a hand and pointed him in the right direction. The detective went inside the bedroom, and within minutes, he made a troubling discovery. Nathan stored weapons underneath his bed. The detective found throwing stars and swords, but most disturbingly were all the knives. Boxes and boxes of knives. Elsie felt sure he would find the murder weapon among all these blades, so he bagged up each knife individually to be tested for blood. After that, Elsie left the bedroom and confronted Nathan again. He asked if Nathan had a fascination with violence, but Nathan said it really wasn't like that. He just liked to collect weapons that he thought were cool. Elsie didn't know what to make of that, but he was not convinced. Next, Elsie went to Nathan's bathroom, which, unlike the rest of the apartment, was a total mess. The counter was covered with containers of deodorant, hair gel, and shaving cream. There was stuff everywhere. But tucked in amongst the chaos was something very odd, even chilling. It was a clear sandwich bag with what appeared to be long reddish-brown hair inside, hair that was the same color as Shelley's. But that wasn't all. There was also what appeared to be drops of blood inside the bag as well. Carefully, with a gloved hand, Elsie lifted the bag up and then went to Nathan and held the bag out in front of him, demanding to know what he was doing with it. But Nathan, whose face now went white, swore he'd never seen it before in his life. He didn't even know what it was, and after all, who would collect a random sandwich bag of hair and blood? It made no sense. And then something shifted in Nathan's mind, and he said he wanted a lawyer before he answered any more questions, and he asked the investigators to please get out of his apartment. Since the detectives didn't have a search warrant, and they were there only as Nathan's guest, legally they had no choice but to leave. But they could keep everything they'd already found, and Elsie was very confident that one of the knives, and also that baggie, would come back positive for Shelley's blood. On Friday, September 18th, so a week after Shelley's body had been discovered, the school held a memorial service for her. When Shelley's parents got there, they were touched to see that Shelley's beautiful art was on display. Shelley's mother, Cynthia, was also moved by just how many people had come out to celebrate Shelley. She never thought her quiet, introverted daughter would have such a large group of friends. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless, that Shelley had meant something to so many people. Then, a young man with a lip piercing and tattoos approached Cynthia. He introduced himself as Nathan, Shelley's boyfriend. He told her he wasn't sure if he should be speaking to her, but he just wanted her to know how sorry he was that Shelley had died, and then he held out his hand for her to shake it. But Shelley's mother couldn't do it. She had seen the look on Detective Elsie's face after she had mentioned the breakup, and she knew exactly what the detective was thinking, that Shelley's boyfriend, Nathan, had murdered Shelley. And now, with Nathan standing right in front of her, Cynthia couldn't help but feel repulsed, and so she did not shake his hand, and so Nathan just stood there awkwardly for a second, and then Nathan got the hint, lowered his hand, and walked away. By the end of September, the analysis of the knives and the baggie that were taken from Nathan's apartment came back from the lab. The first result shocked Elsie. None of the knives in Nathan's apartment had any traces of blood, Shelley's or anybody else's. However, that little baggie containing the hair inside of Nathan's bathroom did have blood in it, and it belonged to Shelley. And so Elsie assumed, after Nathan killed his girlfriend, he must have taken that as sort of like a trophy from the murder scene to add to his bizarre collection. So, on October 8th, 2009, almost a month after Shelley was murdered, Detective Elsie called Nathan to the police station for a second interview. But this time, Nathan showed up with his lawyer. And the lawyer, who spoke on behalf of Nathan, said that Nathan was happy to answer the officer's questions and wanted to do whatever he could to help catch Shelley's killer. But the lawyer hoped that this conversation would be civil. Elsie knew what that meant. He would have to keep a lid on how aggressively he questioned Nathan, or potentially they would just leave. And so Elsie nodded and then told Nathan that the bag they'd found in his bathroom contained his girlfriend's hair and blood. And so he asked Nathan to please explain how it got there. Nathan's lawyer looked down at Nathan and nodded, letting him know it was okay to answer this question. Nathan took a deep breath and then looked at Elsie and told him he had never seen that baggie before. He swore it. But he argued that that really shouldn't be that surprising. After all, he was not the only person who lived in that apartment. And his roommate, whose name was Daniel Willem, did have easy access to the bathroom. And Nathan didn't stop there. He claimed that his roommate, Daniel, was jealous of his relationship with Shelley because Daniel actually had a crush on Nathan. In fact, Nathan said Daniel had gotten really possessive of him and wanted to control him. Elsie asked Nathan if his roommate, Daniel, had ever made a legitimate pass at Nathan, like really tried to be romantically involved with him, and Nathan said no, he had not. And so even though Elsie didn't know what to make of this, he suspected that maybe this crush that he was talking about was not real, and perhaps Nathan was just throwing his roommate under the bus to protect himself. Elsie turned to the lawyer and said that things didn't look good for his client. The investigators had found Shelley's blood in his bathroom, and he said that Nathan had a motive to hurt Shelley because he knew that she planned to break up with him. Plus, Nathan had a reputation for having an explosive temper. And so, if Nathan confessed right now to what he did, maybe the prosecutor would be lenient with him. At this point, the lawyer stood up and said the interview was over, and then he led Nathan out of the room. At this point, Elsie felt sure that Nathan really was just raising suspicions about his roommate simply to protect himself. But the detective had been around long enough to know that he would need to speak with Daniel as well, because it was true he did have access to that bathroom where that baggie was found. So, a couple of days later, Elsie got in touch with Daniel and asked him to come to the police station to answer a few questions. And once Daniel was there, Elsie decided not to ask him about his supposed crush on Nathan right away. Instead, Elsie asked Daniel where he was the morning of Shelley's murder, and Daniel described his busy day. Daniel said he went to Starbucks to grab a coffee, and then after that, he drove to the lake to take some photographs for school, and then he went to Walmart to pick up some soap and hair dye, and then after that, he'd gone to a friend's apartment to work on an assignment. However, that friend wasn't home. Elsie's ears perked up. Daniel's alibi was not any better than Nathan's. Daniel had said when he took photos at the lake, he was alone, and since the friend that he had gone to study with wasn't home, there was no one to corroborate that part of his story either. So then at this point, Elsie asked Daniel if he had romantic feelings for Nathan, and Daniel said absolutely not. Then Elsie told him that Nathan had said that Daniel was very controlling about their relationship, and he asked Daniel if that was true. And Daniel said something surprising. He said that yes, he actually was pretty controlling, but he was only doing it because he was concerned for Nathan. Daniel said that Nathan was stalking Shelley. He was following her around all the time to the point where he was ignoring his own classes and his grades were dropping. Daniel said he was actually trying to get Nathan away from Shelley. This surprised Elsie. Now, both roommates were basically suggesting that the other could have killed Shelley. And if it was true that Nathan really was stalking Shelley, well, Elsie already felt like he was the most likely suspect, and that sort of fit. At this point, Elsie asked Daniel about that little bag that contained the hair and blood inside of Nathan's bathroom. and Daniel told him he had no idea how that got there. Now, of course, if Daniel did do it, obviously he would say he didn't know where it came from. This is what Elsie was thinking. The bag with Shelley's blood and hair was easily the most damning piece of evidence they had, and both roommates claimed they knew nothing about it. So Elsie used the same tactic he had tried with Ashley and with Nathan. He flat out accused Daniel of the murder, hoping his tough cop routine would intimidate him and get him to come out and confess. But when he accused Daniel of the murder, just like Ashley and Nathan before him, Daniel swore up and down it really was not him. Elsie tried pressing him again and again, but just like Ashley and Nathan, Daniel said, "Really, I had nothing to do with this." After Daniel left the station, Detective Elsie stayed in the interview room for a few minutes, thinking about everything he had just learned. He had 3 likely suspects. There was Ashley, who apparently was just in the apartment going about her business with her roommate's dead body for 18 hours. There was Nathan, who Shelley wanted to break up with, and apparently who had a very bad temper. And finally, there was Daniel, who may have seen Shelley as a romantic rival, if Daniel really did have a crush on Nathan. But all 3 of these suspects totally insisted they had nothing to do with the crime. And so Elsie felt like one of them had to be lying. He just needed to figure out who. So Elsie and his team started digging deeper into each of their suspects' alibis. Elsie found himself staring at computer screens, surveillance tapes, and phone messages for days on end. But after so many hours, when he felt like he could barely keep his eyes open anymore, something on one of those screens finally jumped out at him. Elsie was staring at a brand new piece of evidence, and it pointed directly to Shelley's killer. On November 4th, almost 2 months after the murder, police moved in to make an arrest, and Elsie had a very clear idea of what had happened to Shelley. Back on Thursday, September 10th, just after 10:30 a.m., the killer drove to Shelley's apartment complex and put on a pair of latex gloves. They climbed the stairs to the apartment and used a key to unlock the door. They quietly walked in, closing the door behind them. Once inside, they went straight to Shelley's closed bedroom. Slowly, so as not to make any noise, they turned the handle and opened the door. Shelley was fast asleep. The killer slowly walked to the bed, pulled out a knife, raised it up, and then brought it down into Shelley's neck. And then before she could scream, the killer stabbed her again and again and again. The killer stabbed Shelley 42 times in the neck and back before they finally stopped and stepped away from the bed. Shelley would die without ever waking up. After the attack, the killer went into the bathroom. There, they climbed into the bathtub, took off their bloody clothes, and put them into a bag, but in the process, they got spots of blood on the edges of the tub. Then the killer went to the sink and rinsed the last of the blood off their hands, never taking their gloves off. The killer then got dressed in the fresh clothes they brought along. Then they left the apartment, closing and locking the door behind them. When Detective Elsie looked into the 3 alibis of the 3 suspects, initially it seemed like they all checked out. Ashley had been in class, Daniel really had gone to Walmart, and Nathan was in the computer lab for 6 long hours. But while Ashley was in class, something strange was happening. She was getting a near constant stream of text messages asking where she was and if she was home. Elsie believed these text messages were the murderer trying to make sure the house was empty except for Shelley. And the person who sent all those text messages to Ashley was Nathan's roommate, Daniel. Then, when investigators studied surveillance footage from Daniel's trip to Walmart on the morning of the murder, Detective Elsie caught something crucial. Daniel had purchased hair dye, just like he said, but he also purchased blue latex gloves. And the crime lab determined that the material from the brand of gloves matched that little blue piece of latex that had been found on Shelley's wrist. From there, Daniel's alibi fell apart. Surveillance showed he left Walmart at 10:12 a.m., but police could find no evidence that he went by a friend's apartment like he claimed he had. Police then began to look into whether Daniel's story about his roommate Nathan stalking Shelley was actually true, but it turned out if anybody was stalking and obsessed with Shelley, it was actually Daniel. Lots of his own friends said he disliked Shelley because she was dating Nathan, and Daniel was really interested in Nathan to the point where it seemed like he was romantically interested, despite the fact that Daniel denied that. And then also, Daniel would apparently send these aggressive text messages directly to Shelley sometimes, openly disapproving of her and Nathan's relationship, further making it seem like his motive for harming Shelley was because he wanted Nathan for himself. The last piece of the puzzle for Detective Elsie was figuring out how Daniel got into Shelley's apartment. Elsie discovered that Daniel had once borrowed Ashley's car keys, and that gave him the opportunity to make a duplicate of her and Shelley's apartment key, which he then used on the day of the murder. On November 4th, 2011, Daniel was convicted of Shelley's murder and sentenced to life in prison. After the conviction, Shelley's mother found Nathan and gave him a big hug and told him she was sorry for suspecting him and not shaking his hand at the memorial. He accepted her apology. Shelley's family created a scholarship in her honor. Every year since 2011, they've given it out to a student who was pursuing a degree in the arts. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature two horrifying stories that both take place out on the open sea. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Perfect Bait, and it's about a fishing trip that turns into a tragedy. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Gray Blanket, and it's about Japanese fishermen who endure a 2-week-long nightmare that would mark the first time in history humans experienced a particularly terrifying phenomenon. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is fast asleep, secretly take their phone and change their language setting to Chalcatongo Mixtec. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Perfect Bait. At around 1 a.m. on August 27, 2000, a fisherman named Sam Watts did his best to keep his balance on the wet deck of the huge commercial fishing boat that he was working on. And as he tried to do that, he looked over at his crewmate, Michael Edwards, another fisherman, who was grabbing onto the mast as the ship rocked underneath their feet. Sam and Michael and the 4 other crew members on board this boat had just dropped their anchor 56 miles off the northeast coast of Queensland, Australia, and up until about an hour earlier, the sea had been very calm. But now, this huge storm had rolled in, the wind had picked up, the waves were huge, and while the 4 other crew members had already gone below to try to catch some sleep, Sam and Michael were now on the deck, doing their best to try to secure everything before they went down below. And so as the wind is whipping and the waves are smashing against the side of this boat, Sam and Michael decide they should split up to work more efficiently, where Sam will go to the front of the boat and Michael will go to the back of the boat, and they would each kind of work towards the middle of the boat, checking all the fastenings and the knots to make sure everything was good. And then when they reached the center, they would be good and they could go down below. And so they did that. Sam went to the front, Michael to the back, and as they began to work, they kept constant eye contact with each other because this was obviously a very dangerous thing they were doing.
But at some point, as Sam was making his way, he had to duck down to check a particular fastening. And so when he ducked down, he lost sight of Michael just for a second. But in that split second, this huge rogue wave smashed the side of the boat, practically capsizing it, sending Sam flying towards the railing. But Sam luckily grabbed onto the railing before being thrown into the water. And then as the boat kind of began to rock back to level, Sam instinctively looked back down the ship to look for Michael. And he watched through the darkness and the rain as Michael went careening off the side into the ocean. He hadn't been able to grab onto anything. And so the instant the boat kind of leveled out again, Sam screamed for Michael, but he couldn't see him. And so he ran down below, woke up the whole crew. And so moments later, the crew was on the deck. They had their big spotlights out, scanning the water, through this big storm, looking for signs of Michael. And at the same time, the captain had come up and he was on the radio talking to police. And so several minutes later, a police boat managed to come out to the fishing boat. And at the same time, the crew is still desperately looking for Michael. They haven't found him yet. And now the police began circling around the whole area, calling out for Michael, throwing out buoys into the water in hopes of, maybe Michael sees one and grabs hold. But nobody could find Michael. He was just gone. And so all that morning into the early afternoon, the police continued to look in the area for Michael. The crew on board the fishing boat did the same thing, but still nobody could find a trace of Michael. And so around noon that day, the search was called off. And the police told Sam and the rest of the crew of this fishing boat that unfortunately, at this point, it seemed very likely that Michael had drowned. And so, of course, Sam and the rest of the crew were basically in shock. I mean, this happened so quickly. How could it be that, Michael just a few hours ago was joking around with them, part of the crew, and now he's dead? I mean, it was just unbelievable. But now, unfortunately, Sam and the rest of the crew had to basically put their grief aside and make a very practical, albeit very cold, decision, which was, even though Michael's dead, do we stay out here and continue fishing? Or because of his death, do we just go back home? And you might think that decision was actually super easy to make, that of course, they would pack it in and go back home. How could you possibly stay out here and go fishing considering what had happened? But you need to understand it cost a lot of money to go out on these fishing excursions, and they had just left, and so they had not caught anything. So they had spent all this money and they had no return from it. And these fishermen were not wealthy. In fact, honestly, they needed the money from this trip just to provide for their families. And so if they did turn around right now, I mean, it would really hurt all of them. And it would also make it really hard to get the funding again to go out later. And so after some pretty awkward deliberation, the crew decided that, we got to stay out here and fish. But the silver lining was, hey, if we stay out here for another day or so, maybe Michael's body will float to the surface and we can at least recover him and bring him back home to his family. And so all day that day, the fishermen stayed out and fished, and they were very successful. I mean, one after another, they were catching these cod that were 6 feet long and nearly 100 pounds. They're called flowery cods. But despite how incredible this was for their business, this was not a cause for celebration because they had just lost their friend the day before. And so it was a very somber day. And all day, all the fishermen really are looking out at the water, hoping to see Michael's body. But, by the end of that 24 hours of fishing, they didn't see any sign of Michael. And so they packed everything in and they headed back to port. They sold off all of their cod that they had bought. And then each of the fishermen went back to their families and grieved the loss of their friend. A few days later, a factory worker was standing in front of a fish processing line with this huge 97-pound cod right in front of them. This is one of the flowery cods that Sam and the other fishermen had caught 24 hours after their friend had gone overboard. And so this worker took their knife and, like they did every day all day long, began opening up this fish. And at some point, after cutting it open and looking inside of this enormous cod, the worker just stopped and couldn't believe what they were seeing, and then they began to scream. It would turn out a few days earlier, after Michael had been thrown overboard during that storm, he very likely had been alive when he hit the water. But the area where they were fishing off the coast of Queensland, Australia, was known for having lots of sharks and saltwater crocodiles in the area. And so pretty much immediately, Michael was attacked by either a shark or a crocodile, or maybe both. And during this feeding frenzy, as Michael's getting ripped to pieces, his head got ripped off and began to float away. And at some point, one of those huge flowery cods saw the head and ate it whole. And then later that day, Michael's colleagues caught the cod who caught Michael's head. And so that factory worker who opened up that particular cod saw Michael's undigested head looking up at her, and apparently his face was fixed in terror with his eyes wide and his mouth open as if his final moment had been him screaming.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Gray Blanket. At around 1 a.m. on March 1st, 1954, a 20-year-old fisherman named Oishi Matashishi finally headed down to his bed on the lower deck of the fishing boat that he worked on, which was called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. Oishi was totally exhausted. He and the other 22 crew members had been working practically around the clock, 18-hour days for the last 6 weeks, trying to catch tuna, but so far, this trip had really been a disaster. They had gotten stranded on sandbars, there had been these terrible storms that had nearly capsized the boat, and then also they had lost a lot of their fishing lines when they got snagged on coral reefs. And so, as a result, their tuna hauls so far had been devastatingly low. And Oishi and the rest of the crew were very aware of this. In fact, Oishi was very worried that he would not bring home enough money to support his family. Back when Oishi was 14 years old, his father, who had been the breadwinner for their family, had been crushed to death when he was repairing a ship. And so now Oishi had stepped into that patriarch role, taking care of his mother and his 5 other siblings. And so Oishi really needed a solid paycheck from this trip, and it wasn't looking like that was going to happen. And so Oishi staggered his way into his small room and he collapsed onto his bed, and as he lay there trying to sleep, he felt the ship gently rocking side to side. The ship, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was anchored relatively close to the Marshall Islands, which is a strip of islands right about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. But what's unique about the Marshall Islands is they sit over these huge ancient underwater volcanoes. Now, these volcanoes are dormant, but the captain of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 was weary enough about getting too close to these dormant volcanoes in fear they might erupt, that he intentionally kept them about 80 miles or so away from the Marshall Islands. And so eventually, Oishi did drift off to sleep in his bunk. But 5 hours later, Oishi suddenly sat up wide awake because the little room he was in was now completely flooded with this very bright yellowy light. And so Oishi, he's kind of confused. He felt like it was too early for sunrise, and he checked his watch and he saw it was only 6:45 a.m. And so yes, it was too early for sunrise. So whatever this was, it was not the sun. And then when he went to the little porthole window where all this light was coming in, he had to squint his eyes, but he looked outside and he couldn't tell where this light was really coming from or what it was, but he could clearly see it was coming from the west, and the sun rises in the east. So really, whatever this light was, it was not the sun. At the same time, the rest of Oishi's crewmates who were in this room with him, they were also starting to wake up and kind of looking around like, what's going on here? And then without even saying anything, all of them just rushed out of the room and ran upstairs to the top deck to look around and see what was going on. And when they got up there, Oishi looked out towards the west where these lights were up in the sky, and he couldn't really see a clear point of origin. It wasn't like there was an obvious thing creating these lights. It was more like the western sky was just unbelievably bright and yellow and orange, and it seemed like the light was kind of hovering over where the Marshall Islands would be. And so everyone's thinking, is it possible this is a volcano eruption? Is there something else going on here? And then as the crew is just watching in stunned silence at all these crazy lights in the sky, the lights kind of began to fade and they turned blue and purple, and then they just went away and the entire crew was pitched back into darkness. And as everyone's just standing around having no idea what to make of these lights, the oldest crew member on board, who was 40 years old, he said the one thing that everybody kind of in the back of their mind was thinking about but didn't want to say. The oldest crew member just said, atomic bomb. Just 9 years earlier, the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. Now, Oishi, who was Japanese, he was 11 years old at the time this happened, and it had a profound impact on his life and his family's lives, his friends. I mean, anybody who was alive when this happened, it changed everything. But as Oishi and the rest of his crew were kind of staring out to the west, which was all dark at this point, Oishi thought, there's no way this could have been an atomic bomb. Number one, World War II is over, so there's no reason a bomb would get dropped again. And 2, when those atomic bombs were dropped on Japan 9 years earlier, it vaporized basically everything and everyone in its path. And so for them to be this close to these huge lights, if that were an atomic bomb, wouldn't they too be vaporized? Like, they would not be able to see that and live. And so Oishi began to tell himself, okay, it probably was not a volcano eruption. It probably was not an atomic bomb. I don't know what it was, but we're okay. And while many of the other people on board the ship felt the same way Oishi did, very quickly the call came out amongst the crew to just go ahead and bring in the lines right now. We don't know what these lights were, but we need to head back to port back in Yaizu, Japan. And so quickly, Oishi and the rest of the crew got to work pulling these lines in and prepping the boat to head back to port. And then at some point after Oishi had done what he was supposed to do, he began walking his way down below to the galley to get some food. But when Oishi was about halfway, he suddenly heard this deafening explosion outside coming from the west where these lights had been, and immediately Oishi just jumped onto the ground, covering his head, thinking that was going to protect him. And as he's laying there listening to this unbelievable exploding sound, he's thinking, oh my gosh, one of those volcanoes under the Marshall Islands has indeed erupted. That's what's happening. And any minute now, a giant tsunami wave from this eruption is going to flip us over. We're going to get killed here. And so Oishi, as this massive exploding sound is going on, he jumps to his feet and he runs upstairs and he finds the majority of the crew that was still up there had jumped to the ground and they were just kind of protecting themselves. A couple braver crew members had stood up and were kind of looking out towards the west to see if they could see what was going on. But there were no lights now. It was just these crazy loud exploding sounds coming from the west. And then suddenly all the sound stopped, and Oishi and the crew at that point braced for what they believed was this inevitable tsunami wave that was going to hit them. But the weird thing is after the exploding sound stopped, everything was totally calm. In fact, Oishi glanced over the edge of the boat, and he saw the water was totally placid, more calm than normal. And after a few more minutes went by and no massive tsunami wiped them all out, the crew was like, what's going on here? And so as Oishi and the rest of the terrified crew on deck began exchanging wild theories about what these lights and these sounds could have been, ranging from, again, the volcano or maybe an atomic bomb, or some said maybe an asteroid hit the Earth. And as they're doing that, the ship captain called out again, hey, finish pulling in the lines. We need to get out of here right now. We don't know what that was. We don't know what's coming next. We gotta go. Now, for reference, pulling in these lines was not as simple as it sounded. It was kind of a long and complicated process, and so Oishi and the rest of the crew, they began doing their best to pull these lines in as quickly as they could. But when the sun finally rose in the east, the crew on board the Lucky Dragon number 5, as they looked out towards the west, towards the Marshall Islands, they began to notice these weird gray clouds forming over these islands. And as the crew began to talk about these strange-looking clouds, they noticed that despite the wind blowing from east to west, these clouds, these weird clouds over the islands, were actually making their way towards them. Basically, they were moving against the wind, which made no sense. And so as these clouds got closer and closer, the ship captain was screaming at Oishi and the others to hurry up, get these lines in, we gotta go, we don't want to wait for this cloud. But it just was taking so long to pull in these lines, and before long, these weird gray clouds had moved directly over them and blocked out the sun. It was like it was nighttime all over again. And as soon as these clouds were right above them, Oishi and the others, they just stopped and looked up. And suddenly it started to rain. Except not normal rain. It was like this weird milky substance, like gray milky color, and it was also hot. And so Oishi put his hands out and he cupped all this weird liquid in his hands, and nobody knew what it was. And then before long, the rain turned into sleet, still kind of gray and milky, and then the sleet turned into what looked like snow. And so Oishi and the others, they had their hands out still, and they were catching these weird snowflakes, but they didn't melt in their hands. They just kind of pooled on their hand and just sat there. Now, Oishi and the others were definitely unsettled by this snow, and frankly by everything that had happened that morning. They really did not understand what was going on, but there was something kind of incredible about this weird substance that was coming out of the sky. To the point where many of the fishermen on board grabbed bags and saved some of this weird, mushy snow stuff to bring back home, to maybe show their families and friends, or even to give to science to see if maybe they could study it and see what it was. And so after Oishi and the rest of the crew had kind of gotten over the novelty of this weird snow coming out of the sky, they just got right back to work pulling in these lines. And the whole time, remember, they're getting dumped on by this weird stuff that's not melting, and it's building up on the deck to the point where they have to stop what they're doing and shovel this stuff off the deck just to continue pulling in the lines. And for hours and hours they did that, just under this weird snowstorm. And then finally, right around noon, all the lines had been pulled in, and the ship's captain turned the wheel, and they began heading towards port. The next morning, Oishi woke up inside of his bunk on board the Lucky Dragon number 5. It would take several days to make it all the way back to port. And when Oishi woke up, he was suddenly struck with this intense nausea. And so he got up and stumbled his way into the bathroom, and just kind of out of instinct, he grabbed his toothbrush and began brushing his teeth. And as he did this, he had this weird feeling that his teeth felt like they were loose, that if he brushed too hard with his toothbrush, that he could knock his teeth clear out of his jaw. And then when Oishi spit into the sink, he saw there was all this blood. And so Oishi began to panic, and he opened up his mouth and he stared in the mirror to see if maybe he had lost some teeth. But his teeth looked okay. But again, everything felt wrong, and he felt so sick. And so Oishi, he left the bathroom and went upstairs to the top deck. And when he got up there, he saw many of the other members of the crew, and they looked terrible. Their skin was a weird gray color, and some of them had blisters all over their skin. And so to Oishi and to the other crew members, it now seemed kind of obvious that whatever was coming out of the sky, that weird milky substance and that weird snow that didn't melt, clearly it must be toxic in some way, or maybe it's led to some horrible allergic reaction. And so Oishi and the others began referring to the stuff that came out of the sky as death ash. And the fishermen who had gathered up a lot of this death ash into bags to bring back home were now too scared to even touch the bags. Like, they wanted to take the bags and dump the contents overboard, but the fear of interacting with that weird death ash was too much. And so there were these bags kind of draped all over the ship that nobody went near that contained this stuff. And over the next few days that the Lucky Dragon number 5 continued its journey towards port, Oishi and the rest of the crew members continued to get sicker and sicker. In fact, on one day, Oishi was outside unfurling one of the sails, and as he was hoisting this rope, he noticed the rope was covered in blood. And then when he looked at his hands, he realized it was because his hands were basically disintegrating as he was touching the rope, like his skin was just falling apart. And then in addition to his skin falling off, Oishi's hair began falling out in huge clumps. And he was not alone. Many of the other crew members on board the Lucky Dragon number 5 had the same things going on. It was like everybody was just totally deteriorating, and they all knew it had to be connected to whatever the heck they had heard and seen when there was that explosion and the lights and the stuff raining out of the sky. They didn't know what it was, but it could not be a coincidence. That happened, and now this was happening to them. And so finally, on March 14th, the crew of the Lucky Dragon number 5 pulled into port in Yaizu, Japan, and as they got off, they made this interesting decision to not tell anyone what happened to them. They all had this fear that, if it got out, that people knew what happened to them, that somehow they'd get in trouble. And so they all decided they would treat whatever was happening to them, but they would do it kind of secretly. And so Oishi, as soon as he left the boat, he went straight to the doctor's office, and as best as he could, he tried to kind of discreetly tell the doctor what had happened during this fishing trip. And then he showed the doctor all these lesions on his skin and the bald spots and the fact that he was so sick and that his teeth felt loose. And the doctor's like, I got no idea what's wrong with you. And so all he did was prescribe Oishi some zinc ointment to put on all of these blisters and lesions on his skin. And he told Oishi that, this should work. It should clear everything up and you should be okay. But, come back if this ointment doesn't work. A few hours later, a woman was inside of her home in the port city of Yaizu, right near where the Lucky Dragon number 5 had docked, when she heard a knock on her front door. And so she put her broom up against the wall, she walked to the front door, she opened it up, and standing right outside was this horrible-looking man who had gray skin and lesions all over him and all these bald spots, and he was smiling, and his teeth were all red, like there was blood all over his teeth. And for a second, she thought about slamming the door, but then she looked more closely and she realized it was her neighbor, Oishi. As soon as she realized this, she said, Oishi, what happened to you? And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders like he didn't have a way to explain all of this. And then he held out a small gray package and he just said, here's some extra fish that we caught on the last fishing trip I was on. I just wanted to give it to you. And the woman, who was still totally caught off guard by how terrible Oishi looked, she just turned and pointed at her kitchen table, telling Oishi to put the fish on the table. And so Oishi came inside and limped his way into the kitchen and put the package down. And then when he turned to leave, the woman stopped him and she said, Oishi, tell me what's going on here. You look horrible. You have all these bloody bandages on you. Was there a fire on the boat? Was there some sort of accident? Tell me. And so Oishi, he looked down for a second and then he looked back at her and said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Because again, remember, Oishi and the rest of the crew had decided they were not going to share details of what happened. And so this woman, who really liked Oishi and wanted to make sure he was okay, she just said, okay, you don't got to tell me about it, but here, have a seat, we'll catch up about other things. And so Oishi, he nodded and took a seat inside the living room. And as he sat there, the woman went into the kitchen and she got a cup of water, she brought it back and she handed it to him. And Oishi, he took the cup with a trembling hand and he sat there drinking his water, just looking so terrible. And the woman, she really didn't know what to say. She did not understand at all what was happening. But she could tell, Oishi does not want to talk about it. And so to kind of break up the silence, she just began talking about stuff she had heard on the news. And the big news story that everybody was talking about was the science experiment that was done out near the Marshall Islands. And when this woman talked about a science experiment and the Marshall Islands, Oishi dropped his glass and it shattered on the ground, and he just stared at this woman with a look of absolute terror on his face. And at this point, Oishi decided he was not going to keep his story secret anymore, and so he told his neighbor what had happened out on the water, the explosions, the lights, the rain, the snow, all of it. And after he did, the woman became terrified and said, get out of my house, go, go, go. And so Oishi, he got up and he kind of ran out of the house, not really sure what was going on. And then the woman, after Oishi was gone, she turned and she realized the package of fish that Oishi had left was sitting inside of her kitchen. And so she screamed and she too ran out the door. Over the next few days, more and more of the fishermen from the Lucky Dragon number 5 began to talk about what had happened out on the water, and as those stories began to circulate, they began to make the news all over the world. And as this happened, fish markets all over Japan had to shut down and destroy thousands and thousands of pounds of fish in fear that it might have come from the Lucky Dragon number 5. And the reason why everybody was so scared of coming in contact with anything that had been on board the Lucky Dragon, whether it was the fish or the people, is because on March 1st, 1954, when Oishi was suddenly woken up by the bright light outside coming from the west, and then there was that loud explosion, and then the cloud and the rain and the snow, all of that was not a volcano, it was not an atomic bomb, it was not a meteorite, it was not a fire, it was that science experiment that was talked about on the news. The US military was testing a brand new weapon that is quite possibly the most lethal weapon ever made. It's called a hydrogen bomb, and for reference, hydrogen bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than atomic bombs. Now, they detonated this hydrogen bomb far away from all of civilization,
However, the Lucky Dragon number 5 was just close enough to this explosion that the crew on board the ship became the first humans in history to experience something called fallout, which is when deadly radioactive particles from this explosion get thrown up into the sky from the blast, and then they rain down on you like snow. That weird material they were feeling that they called death ash, that's the fallout. It's all radioactive. And in fact, the actual material itself that was raining down on them was coral reefs. They had basically been liquefied from this hydrogen blast. They got shot up into the sky, and then that's what fell down on them. That's why it wasn't melting. It was coral reefs. And so the reason Oishi and the rest of the crew got so sick and their skin began falling off and their hair began falling off was because of their contact with this fallout, this death ash. And so once they began sharing their story of what happened out there and it began making the news, the crew of the Lucky Dragon was rounded up and sent to a special medical facility where they were quarantined. And unbelievably, only one of them died. He was the oldest crew member who had brought up that maybe the lights they had just seen was an atomic bomb. But even though the rest of the crew survived, they would spend the rest of their lives battling strange diseases and cancers, and many of them would become sterilized, and those that weren't, their children often had birth defects. As for Oishi, he gave up being a fisherman and instead became a dry cleaner, but he wound up spending the bulk of the rest of his life being an anti-bomb advocate and author until his death in 2021, when he would pass away at the age of 87.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Runful, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 stories about people whose disappearances are still totally shrouded in mystery. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Jameson Family, and it's about one of the most famous family disappearances of all time. Their truck was found tucked away in a forest. It contained their emaciated dog and $32,000 in cash, but what they discovered next was truly horrifying. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Siberian Cabin, and it's about 4 friends who stay the night in a cabin deep in a Siberian forest, and everything's going great until they wake up, when they immediately realize something was wrong. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button gives you their phone to please capture a once-in-a-lifetime picture for them, say of course you'll do it, but when you take it, be sure to leave your finger right over the camera's lens. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Jameson Family. In 2009, the Jameson family, which was Bobby, who was 44, Sherilyn, who was 40, and their daughter Madison, who was 6 years old, were living in Eufaula, Oklahoma on lakefront property. While they seemed to be living a simple and happy life, behind the scenes, their life was in turmoil. Bobby suffered from bad chronic back pain that he had as a result of a car accident that he was in 2003. Sherilyn was bipolar. She was medicated for it, but she didn't always take her meds, causing her to lash out at her family members, and it caused bouts of severe depression. Bobby and Sherilyn also believed that their house was haunted by 3 or 4 spirits who lived on their roof. Bobby was so convinced of this that he went to his pastor and asked where he could buy special bullets that he could shoot at these spirits. So for all of these reasons, the Jameson family was actually looking to leave their property in Eufaula and move somewhere else and hopefully start all over again, fresh, with a new shot at happiness. After the Jamesons would vanish, their family and friends would say, "We had no idea any of this was happening. We had no idea they were even considering a move." Now, this move they were considering was not a typical move. They were not looking to move into another house. They were looking to move onto a piece of property where they could place their storage container and live in the storage container until at some point they were going to build a house on a mountain and then move into the house. And they had actually already found a plot of land about 30 miles away from where they were currently living in a town called Red Oak. Now, the storage container itself that they planned on living in was actually sitting on their property in Eufaula. And it drew a lot of attention from the neighbors because Sherilyn would graffiti on it, "The neighbors have poisoned our cats. Witches don't like it when you kill their cats," because it turns out Sherilyn believed that she was a witch. So unsurprisingly, the neighbors avoided the Jameson family at all cost. Several weeks before the Jameson family went missing, they actually brought in a male boarder. So a guy that was going to live with them and help with manual labor in exchange for room and board. The boarder was a white supremacist that immediately took exception to Sherilyn, who was part Native American. And so anytime Bobby was out of the house, the white supremacist boarder would get into a fight with Sherilyn. And one day it came to a head and Sherilyn drew a gun on the boarder and said to leave the property or she was going to shoot him. The boarder refused to leave, and so Sherilyn began firing shots into the ground at his feet until he left. Now, once the Jameson family disappeared, this white supremacist boarder became one of the primary suspects. But when the FBI found him, he had a rock-solid alibi and was quickly crossed off the list of potential suspects. On October 8th, 2009, Bobby, Sherilyn, their daughter Madison, and their dog Maisie load up the truck and they start driving towards Red Oak. They were apparently going to go scout out this piece of property that they wanted to purchase to live on with the storage container. Now, according to family and friends, it was not uncommon for the Jamesons to vanish for several days at a time without telling anybody where they went. And it would turn out that they would go into the woods for these retreats where they would get away from technology in the city. When they were gone for a few days and no one had heard from them, no one thought twice about it. On top of this, Bobby and Sherilyn had informed Madison's school that they'd be pulling her out of class because they were going to be moving. So when Madison didn't show up for school, the school did not raise any alarms because they assumed she'd been pulled out of school. On October 16th, 2009, 8 days after the Jamesons had left their house to go scout out this property in Red Oak, a couple of hunters in the Panola Mountains, which is near Red Oak, found the Jamesons' truck parked on the side of the road. Now, these hunters are in the middle of nowhere, which means the truck is in the middle of nowhere. And so as they're walking over to it, they're expecting to see the owner of the truck. But as they get over to the truck, there is no owner anywhere. They called out a couple times to see if they could get this person's attention or whoever it was that owned it, and no one came over to them. They look in the truck and they see there is this very sick-looking dog sitting on the back seat. It would turn out it was the Jamesons' dog. It was Maisie. Now, the windows were up and the truck was locked, so the hunters called the police. Police show up, they break a window, and they get Maisie out of the truck. They give her food and water, and she would end up making a full recovery. They look in the vehicle, and all of the Jamesons' personal effects are in there. Their phones, their wallets, their jackets, their clothes. Underneath the front seat was $32,000 of cash in a bank bag. Also, they found this weird letter written by Sherilyn to Bobby that was this 11-page hate letter that basically accused Bobby of being a hermit, which seems like a strange thing to ramble for 11 pages about, but either way. The police did an initial search of the area looking for the Jameson family, but they couldn't find them. And so the running theory was they must have pulled over and walked into the woods for some reason, got turned around, and they're just lost, and we need to go find them. The police were able to use the cell phones that had been left inside of the vehicle and were able to use their GPS locations and track where the phones had been before coming to rest inside of this vehicle. And they saw that the cell phones had actually gone up the trail a little ways. They had been up towards the top of the mountain for about 15 minutes before coming back down and then wound up in the truck where they were when they were found. So the police walk up the hill to where the GPS said they had been, and they find all these footprints that look to be Madison's because there's a child's footprint as well as probably Bobby's and Sherilyn's. But they're nowhere to be found, and there's no clue of where they went after being up there. When they started scanning through each of the cell phones to see if there was any information about where they might have gone, they found on Bobby's phone a picture of Madison that was taken up at that little location that the GPS took them. The picture of Madison has been hotly contested on the internet for a long time now. It's hard to tell in the image if Madison is happy or sad. It's also unclear based on her body language if her parents are taking the photo or if this was kind of staged by someone else. So between the GPS showing that they had been at the top of this mountain at one point, plus the picture of Madison confirming she had at least been up there, the police started this massive search with that section on the mountain where they had been standing as kind of the center point. And they searched all around the Panola Mountains. But after an extensive search of this new area, they didn't find anything. No new leads had come in, so ultimately the search was called off. 4 years later, in November of 2013, some hikers were in the Panola Mountains, about 5 kilometers, maybe a little bit less, from where the Jameson truck was found. And they come across skeletal remains of 3 individuals. It looked like 2 adults and a child. They were laying face down side by side, and it was clear that they were not complete skeletons, but there was enough there to know for sure that these are people. As soon as the police were called, everybody assumed this has to be the Jameson family. It would actually take almost a year before they were able to confirm that yes, those bones are in fact the Jameson family. While the Oklahoma medical examiner was not able to determine a cause of death because the remains were just partial, they didn't have enough to work with, they did see that there was a big hole in the back of Bobby's skull and there was other holes in some of the other bones that many people assumed were from bullets, but it was never determined if that actually was what it was from. As soon as it came out that it was the Jameson family's remains, the first prominent theory was that this had to have been a murder-suicide, where Sherilyn, who was mad at Bobby, she wrote that hate-filled 11-page letter that was found in the car. She's unstable from not taking her medication to combat her bipolar disorder. She seems like the person that would take her family out and then turn on herself. But all of her family said she would never harm her daughter. Maybe she would have harmed Bobby, but she never would have harmed her daughter. Also, why would you have brought your dog along and left your dog in the car and $32,000 of cash in the car? So that doesn't fit that scenario at all. The next theory was, well, maybe they just pulled over, walked into the woods for some reason, and then got lost and died of exposure. And that's still definitely a possible theory, except at the time they went missing, the temperatures were very mild. They were not dropping below freezing at night. It didn't rain very much, so it was kind of perfect conditions to be lost in the woods. It would have taken quite a while for them to die from exposure. And if you add in the fact that they were searching that area that they were found in pretty extensively within a few days of them going missing. If they had been lost and were only a few kilometers from the road, they would have been found in that search, but they weren't. The next theory that friends and family of the Jameson family predominantly believe is they were kidnapped. That maybe, they were driving on that road and someone flagged them down, whether it was someone they knew or someone that did not seem threatening, that caused them to get out of their car and come over to them, leaving their car the way it was with all of their belongings inside and with their dog inside, shut the door, they're not threatened. They walk over to this person or this group, and then something happens where they are either against their will or they're complicit, and they walk into the woods, never to go back to their truck, and then they ultimately pass away in the woods just a few kilometers away. However, none of those theories can account for the very bizarre video footage that they have of the Jameson family on the day they left their house to go check out the property in Red Oak. So on October 8th, 2009, the video shows Bobby and Sherilyn making multiple trips, about 20 or more, from their house to their truck, where they're loading gear into their truck. But they appear to be almost in a trance, which is what the sheriff said when he first saw the video. They're walking back and forth and they're carrying their stuff into the truck, but periodically they're making trips without carrying anything. They're just walking to the truck with nothing in hand, looking at the truck, and then walking back to the house. And then they come back out and they have something in their hands, and then the next trip they have nothing. And periodically on their trek back and forth, they would just stop and just turn and look off into the distance, not interacting with each other. Bobby and Sherilyn haven't spoken to each other at all. They're just doing this weird trance-like commute back and forth between truck and house before ultimately they load up the truck and they do leave. A lot of people speculated that, well, it looks like Bobby and Sherilyn must have been using drugs. But when they first found the truck and they searched the Jameson's truck and they searched the Jameson family house, there was no traces of drugs anywhere, and their family said there's no history of drug abuse. There was also a theory that perhaps the Jameson family got tied up in a cult, and that was why they were moving and they were going to live this minimalist lifestyle, and they had brought cash to, give to this cult, but in fact they had actually been the target of the cult, and that was what led to their demise. Or maybe they were complicit and they wanted to sacrifice themselves or something, but no one really knows. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Siberian Cabin. When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country. But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally. The average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madsen. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected, because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan, and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan. And when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally, at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely. And if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m. because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m. and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up, and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin, and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing.
The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying, and they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush, and when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing, and Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding onto him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot, and he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate. Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober. Although, technically, he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing. And so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered, someone crushed his airway, or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him, meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him, and what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest?
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.